Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The evening light was fading fast on the church property fields. My skinny 12-year-old legs struggled to keep up with Grandpa Thompson's steady pace as we walked the familiar dirt path. It was late summer 1986. The air felt thick with humidity, and mosquitoes buzzed around my ears. Sweat trickled down my back, dampening my faded blue t-shirt. "Keep up, Michael," Grandpa called over his shoulder. He carried his old Remington shotgun cradled in his right arm, not for hunting, just protection. Wildlife's most active at dusk. Gotta move quiet if we want to see anything good. I nodded, stepping carefully over twigs and loose stones. Grandpa had taught me how to walk silently in the woods. The wind blew against our faces, carrying our scent away from anything ahead, another hunting trick Grandpa had explained. "Perfect wind direction," he said, pausing to let me catch up. His weathered face crinkled as he looked at the sky. "We might get lucky tonight." We passed the old abandoned Wilkins house, its windows dark empty sockets in the dying light. The wooden porch sagged like it might collapse any day now. 10 more minutes of walking brought us to the barn on the hill. It belonged to the church property too, though nobody used it anymore except for the occasional raccoon family or barn owl. "Let's head up past the barn," Grandpa said. "Good view of the big field from up there." I followed his lead, panting slightly as we climbed the gentle slope. Tall grass brushed against my jeans. Crickets chirped all around us. The familiar smells of dirt, grass, and pine filled my nose. We reached the crest of the hill just as the sun dipped below the tree line. The view opened up before us, a massive field stretching maybe 200 yards wide and twice that in length. The grass was a mix of gold and green in the fading light. Beyond the field stood a dense line of pine and oak trees, dark against the purpling sky. That's when I saw it. At first my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. About 20 feet from the tree line on the far side of the field stood something dark and massive. It was standing upright on 2 legs like a person, but it was all wrong. Too big. Way too big. Its entire body was covered in dark hair that moved slightly in the evening breeze. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered in my chest. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the dim light. But when I looked again, it was still there, a huge, hairy figure standing at the edge of the field. I raised my arm, pointing toward the creature. "Grandpa," I whispered. "What is that?" Grandpa didn't answer right away. He squinted, his body going completely still beside me. After several seconds, he said quietly, "I don't know." But something in his voice made me think he might be lying. We stood frozen, watching. The creature seemed to be scanning the field, its massive head moving slowly from side to side. It was hunting, I realized, looking for rabbits or deer, maybe. Its hair, dark brown or black, I couldn't tell in the fading light, rippled as the wind picked up. For 10 or 15 seconds it remained with its back to us. Then, as if sensing our presence, its torso twisted in our direction. Its head turned, and I felt like it was looking right at us across the field. My stomach tightened, but strangely I wasn't scared. Maybe it was because we were so far away, or maybe it was because Grandpa was beside me with his shotgun. The creature made no aggressive moves. It just stood there, observing us as we observed it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, it turned away. With 3 or 4 unhurried steps, it walked into the tree line and disappeared from view. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, not the lumbering gait I would have expected from something so large. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice cracking slightly. Grandpa nodded, his jaw tight. "Time to head back," he said firmly. But we always go all the way around the loop, I protested. Our evening walks usually took us in a full circle through the church property and back to our cabin. Not tonight, Grandpa said. He placed his hand on my shoulder and gently turned me around. We're going back the way we came. The walk back was silent. Grandpa moved faster than before, checking over his shoulder every few minutes. The shotgun, previously carried casually, was now gripped tightly in both hands. The sky darkened quickly, and by the time we reached the abandoned house, I needed my flashlight to see the path. "Grandpa, what was that thing?" I finally asked as we approached our cabin. The warm yellow light from the windows looked extra welcoming after what we'd seen. "Probably just a bear," he said, but he didn't look at me when he said it. "Bears don't stand on two legs like that," I argued. "Not for that long. And it was huge," Grandpa sighed. "Some things in these woods are best left alone, Michael. Best not to talk about it." He refused to discuss it further that night, or any night after that. The years passed. I grew taller than Grandpa, graduated high school, then college. I moved to Nashville for work, but came back to visit at least once a month. We still took walks in the woods when I visited, but Grandpa always chose routes that avoided the church property fields. It was during my 26th year when Grandpa's health began to fail. His strong frame grew thin, and his once steady hands developed a slight tremor. The doctors found cancer in his lungs. Decades of smoking Marlboros had finally caught up with him. During one of my weekend visits, I found him sitting on the porch of the cabin, staring out at the tree line. It was nearly the same time of day as when we'd seen the creature 14 years earlier. "You thinking about it?" I asked, settling into the chair beside him. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Never really stopped thinking about it," he admitted. "You knew what it was, didn't you?" I said. It wasn't really a question. Grandpa was quiet for a long time. The only sounds were the creaking of his rocking chair and the distant call of a whippoorwill. "First time I saw one, I was about your age," he finally said. "Maybe 13. Was hunting with my daddy out near Cooper Creek. Saw it clear as day, drinking from the stream. Bigger than the one we saw together. Daddy made me swear never to tell a soul." "What was it, Grandpa?" I pressed. He looked at me with tired eyes. "Locals called them different things. Wood apes, wild men, Sasquatch. But names don't matter much. They're just as real as you and me. Why didn't you tell me back then?" He shrugged. "What good would it have done? Nobody believes in such things anymore. They'd have said you had an overactive imagination or that I was filling your head with nonsense. Besides," he added, "some knowledge comes with a burden." "What do you mean?" "That land belongs to them as much as to us. More, maybe. They were here first, but people—" He trailed off, coughing. When he recovered, he continued. "People fear what they don't understand, and when people fear something, they try to destroy it." I thought about that encounter again. The massive figure standing at the forest edge, its calm assessment of us, its unhurried departure. There had been an intelligence in its movements, a deliberateness that haunted me. "You've seen them more than once, haven't you?" I asked. Grandpa nodded slowly. "The church property used to be part of my daddy's land. We sold it when times got hard, but I knew what lived in those woods. I kept an eye on things over the years, made sure no developers got too interested in that particular patch of forest." "Is that why you always carried the shotgun?" "Never intended to use it on them," he said firmly. "Just wanted to have it if needed. They're stronger than any man, but they're not looking for trouble. They just want to be left alone." "Do they live there? In those woods?" "They pass through. Follow game trails, I expect. They're smart enough to stay hidden most of the time." He looked at me sharply. "You need to understand something, Michael. What we saw that day, that was a gift. Most folks go their whole lives never knowing what's really out there in the deep woods. But now you know." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "That's why we turned back that day," I realized. You were protecting it. Protecting you too, he said. Wasn't sure how it would react to a child. They're not dangerous unless threatened, but I wasn't taking chances. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the yard. In the distance, the church property fields were already dark. You never went back there after that day, did you? I asked. Not with you, he answered, which told me everything I needed to know. Grandpa died 3 months later. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends from town. After the service, I found myself drawn to the church property. I parked my truck by the old access road and walked the familiar path alone. The abandoned house was completely collapsed now. The barn still stood, though its roof had partially caved in. I climbed the hill beyond it, just as we had done that evening in 1986. The field looked smaller than I remembered, but the tree line on the far side was just as dark and impenetrable. I stood there for nearly an hour as the sun began to set, watching, waiting. Part of me hoped to see that figure again, to confirm that my childhood memory wasn't just imagination. Nothing appeared. The field remained empty. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground near my feet. Bending down, I saw what appeared to be a footprint pressed into the soft earth. It was huge, easily 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The impression was deep, suggesting considerable weight. It wasn't human. It wasn't bare. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. I looked up at the tree line again. Was something watching me from those shadows? I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence, the same feeling I'd had as a child when that creature turned to look at us. I won't tell anyone, I said aloud, feeling silly but compelled to speak. Grandpa kept your secret. So will I. The branches at the forest edge moved slightly, though there was no wind. Perhaps it was just a deer or raccoon. Perhaps it was something else. I left the footprint undisturbed and walked back down the hill. At the bottom, I paused and looked back once more. The golden evening light caught something moving at the edge of the trees, something large and dark that stepped partially out of the shadows, then back in. It was too far away to see clearly, but I knew what it was, a witness to my promise, a guardian of the woods that had been here long before us and would remain long after we were gone. I nodded in its direction, a simple acknowledgement between two species sharing the same land, but different worlds. Then I continued down the path toward my truck, leaving the church property fields and their secrets behind. But I've kept my promise, and every few months I return to that hill. I never venture into those woods. I just watch from a distance, honoring Grandpa's wisdom and the unspoken agreement between us and the quiet observers who share this land. Sometimes, when the light is just right and the wind blows in my face, I catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, something that watches me just as I watch it, something that remembers. Story 2. I remember that summer like it was yesterday, not some faded memory from 1971. The heat had baked our farm outside Oregon City for weeks, turning the soil rock hard and the grass brittle beneath our feet. My name's Marcus Jensen, and that August afternoon, my sister Lily and I were doing our regular chores like any normal day. At least it started that way. The sun was starting to dip toward the tree line when Pa asked us to feed the cattle in the far barn before dinner. He and Ma worked second shifts at the paper mill down in West Lynn, leaving us kids to manage things until evening. Our older brother Clyde was supposed to be watching us from the house, but he was probably napping or glued to the television. "Come on, Lily," I said, grabbing the feed bucket. "Let's get this done before it gets dark." Lily was 13 then, 2 years younger than me, with blonde pigtails and overalls that were always covered in dirt from helping around the farm. She followed me out the back door, complaining about missing her favorite afternoon program. "We'll be quick," I promised. "Besides, Pa said rain's coming tomorrow. We need to check if the roof's still leaking in the cattle shed. We walked across the yard, past Ma's struggling vegetable garden, and toward the small barn where we kept the feed. Our property stretched out behind the farmhouse, about 80 acres total, with 2 barns, a cattle shed, and a chicken coop. Beyond our fence line lay Henderson Canyon, thick with Douglas firs and underbrush that neither of us kids were allowed to explore alone. That's when we heard it. A loud crash came from inside the small barn, the one we were heading toward. Then a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. "Did Pa leave the radio on in there?" Lily whispered, grabbing my arm. I shook my head. No radio in that barn. Another crash, followed by what sounded like feed bags tearing. My first thought was raccoons, or maybe a bear, though we hadn't had bear problems in years. "Should we get Clyde?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the barn door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the entire property. My body went rigid. Lily's fingernails dug into my forearm. We both dropped to our knees behind Ma's half-dead tomato plants, the dry soil scraping against my jeans. What stepped out of that barn wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The creature stood upright, walking on 2 legs just like a man, but taller than any man I'd ever seen. It had to be 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its entire body, from its broad shoulders down to its legs, was covered in thick, creamy white hair. Not fur exactly, more like long human hair, but denser. The only part not covered was its face, which I couldn't see clearly from our hiding spot. "Marcus," Lily breathed next to me. Her whole body trembled. "Don't move," I whispered. "Don't make a sound." The white-haired creature paused outside the barn, its head turning slowly as it surveyed our property. I pressed myself lower to the ground, pulling Lily down with me. My heart pounded so hard I was certain the thing would hear it. It didn't see us. Instead, it began walking, not lumbering or shuffling like you'd expect from some monster, but walking with purpose, with human-like strides. Its arms swung naturally at its sides as it crossed our pasture, moving with deliberate steps toward the back of our property, where the land sloped down toward Henderson Canyon. We watched, frozen in place, as it reached the tree line and disappeared into the woods. Only when it had been gone for a full minute did I release the breath I'd been holding. "Was that—" Lily couldn't finish the question. "I don't know," I said, though I did know. I'd heard the stories everyone in Oregon had. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the stories the old-timers told around campfires that us kids pretended not to believe. Except this one was white. Pure white. "We need to get back to the house," I said, grabbing Lily's hand. "Now." We ran. Not across the open pasture where the thing might see us if it was still watching, but along the fence line, keeping low, moving as fast as our shaking legs would carry us. The distance to the farmhouse seemed to stretch forever. When we finally reached the back porch, I yanked the screen door open and pushed Lily inside. I slammed it shut behind us, twisting the lock with trembling fingers. "Clyde!" I shouted, rushing through the kitchen. "Clyde, get down here!" Our brother appeared at the top of the stairs, looking annoyed. "What are you hollering about? I'm trying to—" "There's something out there," Lily cut in, her voice breaking. "By the barn. A monster." Clyde rolled his eyes. "Very funny. If this is to get out of your chores—" "We're not lying," I snapped, moving to lock the front door. "Call Pa. Call him right now." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because Clyde came down the stairs, his expression changing from irritation to concern. "What'd you see exactly?" "A tall white thing," Lily said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It came out of the feed barn and walked to the woods." "White?" Clyde frowned. "Like a ghost?" "No," I said, peeking through the front window blinds. "Like a person, but huge, covered in white hair." Clyde stared at us for a long moment, then walked to the phone hanging on the kitchen wall. He dialed the number for the paper mill. "Asking for Jack Jensen," he said into the receiver. "It's his son. Family emergency." While Clyde talked to Pa, I checked all the windows, making sure they were locked. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her face pale. "Pa's coming home," Clyde announced after hanging up. "Said he'll be here in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were the longest of my life. We sat in the kitchen, jumping at every noise, the refrigerator humming, the wind against the windows, the old house settling. Clyde got his hunting rifle from Pa's closet and sat with it across his lap, though I could tell from his face he thought we were exaggerating. Pa's truck finally rolled up the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. He came through the door, still wearing his mill uniform, his face lined with worry. "What's this about?" he demanded, looking at each of us. Lily and I told him what we'd seen, trying to describe the creature in detail. Pa's expression remained neutral, but his jaw tightened the way it did when he was thinking hard. "And you're sure it wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs?" he asked when we finished. "Bears don't walk like people, Pa," I insisted. "This thing moved like a man, just bigger." Pa ran a hand through his thinning hair. "All right, I'll have a look." "You're not going out there alone?" Ma would have protested, but she was still at work. "It's broad daylight, and whatever it was, it's likely gone now," Pa said, though he took Clyde's rifle anyway. "You kids stay put." We watched from the window as Pa walked across the yard toward the small barn. He moved cautiously, rifle ready, checking around corners before entering the structure. He was inside for maybe 5 minutes before emerging and continuing his search around the property. When he finally returned to the house, his expression was grim. "Something was definitely in there," he admitted, setting the rifle down. "Feed bags torn open, buckets knocked over, barrel lids removed." My skin prickled. "Did you see any tracks?" Pa shook his head. "Ground's too hard from the drought. Couldn't make out any prints." "You believe us, though, right, Pa?" Lily asked, her voice small. Pa sat down heavily at the table. "I believe you saw something." "What exactly? I can't say." He didn't say much more about it that evening, even after Ma came home and heard the story. They had a whispered conversation in their bedroom that night, and the next day, Pa nailed boards across the old storm cellar doors and added new locks to the barn. 3 days later, Sheriff Dawson came by the house. Apparently, the Millers, who lived about 5 miles down the road, had reported livestock disturbances. Something had opened their chicken coop and taken 2 hens. They hadn't seen anything, but their dog had barked all night, refusing to come out from under their porch the next morning. That was the summer the rumors started spreading through Oregon City. People reported strange noises in the woods, livestock going missing, weird tracks found near creek beds where the ground was soft enough to hold impressions. Most folks blamed bears or cougars, but those of us who knew better kept quiet, afraid of being called crazy. Lily and I never talked about it much after that first week, not even between ourselves. It was like if we spoke about it, we'd be admitting something neither of us wanted to face, that the world was stranger and more dangerous than we'd been raised to believe. As August turned to September and school started back up, life returned to normal. The creature, whatever it was, didn't return to our property. At least, not that we saw. But things changed in subtle ways. Pa started coming home earlier from work. He reinforced the fences around our property and installed motion sensor lights that would flood the yard with brightness if anything larger than a raccoon moved across it at night. Ma, who'd always let us play in the backyard until dusk, now called us in by 5 o'clock. "Don't want you caught outside when the light gets tricky," she'd say, as if poor visibility was what worried her. I started having trouble sleeping. My bedroom window faced the woods, and I'd lie awake listening for sounds, branches breaking, footsteps too heavy to belong to deer. Sometimes in that space between wakefulness and sleep, I'd imagine I saw a tall white figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching our house. It wasn't until Halloween that year that I heard anything concrete about what we might have seen. Old Pete Thompson, who ran the general store in town, was known for telling tall tales to anyone who'd listen. Most people wrote him off as a drunk with an overactive imagination. But when Lily and I stopped by his store for candy, his words froze me in place. "White Sasquatch," he said to another customer, not noticing us kids by the counter. "That's what the Chinook tribes called it. Said it lives in the deep woods around these parts. Smarter than the others. Dangerous." "You believe in that nonsense, Pete?" The customer laughed. "Believe what you want." Pete shrugged. "But the logging crew up near Mount Hood, they found something last week. Footprints big as dinner plates in the mud near their equipment. And Joe Harden swears he saw something watching them from the trees. Something tall and white." The customer rolled his eyes, but I felt Lily's hand slip into mine, squeezing tight. We never saw the creature again that year, or the next. As time passed, the memory might have faded into childhood fantasy, except for one thing that happened the following summer. Pa had hired extra help for the harvest, including a man named Russell, who'd worked timber up north for years. One evening, as we all sat on the porch after dinner, Russell got to talking about strange things he'd seen in the forests of Washington. "Strangest was near Mount Baker," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Something watching our camp at night. Big fella pale as moonlight." Pa's head snapped up. "Pale? White-colored, you mean?" Russell nodded. "White as snow. Thought it was a bear at first, standing on its hind legs. But no bear moves like that thing did. No bear watches you with that kind of awareness." Ma tried to change the subject, shooting Pa a warning look, but Russell continued. "Logging companies know about them. Keep it quiet, though. Can you imagine the environmentalists if they knew there was some undiscovered species living in those woods? They'd shut down every operation from California to Canada." That night, I heard Pa and Russell talking late into the evening, their voices low and serious on the back porch. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what they were discussing. 50 years have passed since that summer day when Lily and I saw the white-haired creature. I still live in Oregon, though not on the family farm. Sometimes I take my grandkids camping in the mountains, and when we sit around the fire at night, they beg me to tell them scary stories. I never tell them about what I saw. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when you're deep in the woods where the trees block out the sky and strange sounds echo in the darkness. But I always make sure we're back at the campsite before sunset. Tent zipped tight, fire burning bright to keep the shadows at bay. And sometimes, when everyone else is asleep, I lie awake listening to the forest, wondering if it's out there still, moving silently between the trees, white hair gleaming in the moonlight. The thing about Henderson Canyon and the forests surrounding Oregon City, they're deeper than they look on any map. There are places people never go, places untouched and unexplored, perfect hiding places for things that don't want to be found. And sometimes, on clear nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear something moving out there, watching and waiting with a patience I can't begin to understand. Story 3. My hands were numb from gripping the steering wheel too tight. Highway 93 stretched before me like a pale ribbon through the darkness, my headlights catching the light snowfall as it drifted down. The dashboard clock read 4:17 a.m., 2 more hours to Calgary, where we'd drop off the RV trailers and head home. Dad was about half a mile ahead in his truck, his taillights glowing red in the distance. My name's Olivia Mason. My father Daniel and I run a small transport business out of Cranbrook. We make decent money hauling RVs, boats, and whatever else needs moving across the Canadian Rockies. This was our 3rd run this month to Calgary, nothing special about it. The radio played quiet country music as I followed Dad through the pre-dawn darkness, both of us hauling 28-foot Jayco trailers for a dealership in Calgary. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and adjusted the heater, It was cold. The truck's thermometer read 27 degrees. 2 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight, coating the trees and roadside with white. Beautiful, but it made driving more demanding, especially when you're pulling a trailer. My CB radio crackled. "Liv, you still awake back there?" Dad's voice broke through the static. I reached for the handset. "Yeah, Dad, all good. About half-mile behind you. Weather report says the snow should let up soon. We're making good time." I acknowledged and hung the handset back up. Through my windshield, I could see his brake lights come on. He was slowing down. I eased off the gas, maintaining distance as we approached a gentle curve. That's when it happened. Dad's truck suddenly swerved slightly, his brake lights flaring bright red. I instinctively slowed more, squinting to see what was happening. My headlights swept across the road as I rounded the curve, and that's when I saw it. A massive dark figure was crossing the highway directly in front of Dad's truck. My first thought was, bear. We see black bears and even grizzlies occasionally in these parts, but this was different. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs, not like a bear occasionally stands, but naturally walking upright, like a person. But it wasn't a person. I hit my brakes harder, the trailer pushing against my truck as I slowed. My headlights joined Dad's, illuminating the creature fully now. It stood at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller. Its entire body was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but long hair, maybe 4 inches in length, dark brown or black. It was broad-shouldered, powerfully built, but what made my breath catch wasn't just the creature itself. It was carrying something. Cradled in its massive arms was a smaller version of itself, a baby or a young one. The creature held it protectively, just like a human mother would hold an infant. The smaller one was curled up against the larger one's chest, its small, hairy arms visible. The creature turned its head toward our headlights. I saw its face, not clearly, but enough. Eyes reflected in the light, a broad nose, a face that wasn't human but wasn't exactly animal either. There was unmistakable fear in that face, a mother's fear for her child. It didn't roar or show aggression. It just quickened its pace, hurrying across the road with its child. When it reached the other side, the embankment was steep with fresh snow. The creature stumbled slightly, its foot sliding in the snow. The small one slipped from its grasp, tumbling onto the snow. My hand went to my mouth. The larger creature immediately bent down, gently scooped up the small one, checked it briefly, then continued up the embankment with surprising speed and agility, disappearing into the thick forest. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 seconds. I sat there, hands shaking on the wheel, heart hammering in my chest. The CB radio crackled loudly, making me jump. "Olivia!" My dad's voice was urgent, almost shouting. "Did you see that? Tell me you saw that." I fumbled for the handset. "I saw it, Dad. I saw it. Pull over. Pull over now." I guided my truck and trailer to the shoulder, about 50 yards past where the creature had crossed. Dad was already parked ahead. I shut off the engine, grabbed my jacket, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was falling lightly, landing on my face and hair. My boots crunched in the fresh powder as I walked toward Dad's truck. He was standing by the road, staring at the spot where the creature had crossed. "Dad!" My voice sounded small in the vast silence of the forest. He turned to me, his face pale in the glow of the headlights. "What the hell was that, Liv?" I shook my head. I don't know." "It was carrying a baby," he said, his voice unsteady. "Did you see that? It was carrying a young one." I nodded, hugging myself against the cold. "I saw it." Dad walked to the edge of the road, shining his flashlight where the creature had crossed. The beam caught fresh indentations in the snow, tracks that were definitely not from any animal I recognized. They were large, foot-shaped, but not human, with what looked like 5 toes. The stride length was enormous. "Bigfoot," Dad said quietly. "We just saw a goddamn Bigfoot." I'd never believed in Bigfoot. Growing up in the mountains, we'd heard all the stories. Tourists sometimes claimed sightings, and a few locals swore they'd encountered something in the deep backcountry. But I'd always written it off as bears mistaken in poor light, or people seeing what they wanted to see. But this was no bear. This was no elk or moose. This was something else entirely. "Should we report it?" I asked, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. Dad hesitated. Who would believe us? They'd think we were crazy or attention-seeking. "But there are tracks," I pointed out. "For now, this snow will cover them soon enough." I stepped closer to the tracks, careful not to disturb them. There were two sets, the large ones from the adult creature and smaller impressions where the baby had fallen. I took out my phone and snapped several pictures, making sure to include my boot next to one for scale. The footprint was at least twice the size of my boot. "We're about 20 miles south of Banff," Dad said, checking his GPS. "Middle of nowhere, really. Perfect place for something to stay hidden." We stood there for a few minutes in silence, processing what we'd seen. The falling snow, the dark trees, the empty highway. It all felt surreal now, like we'd briefly stepped into another world. "We should go," I finally said. "We have a delivery to make." Dad nodded, but he seemed reluctant to leave. "We know what we saw, Liv. No matter what anyone else might say, we know." We returned to our trucks and continued our journey. For the next hour we barely spoke over the CB. What was there to say? Every so often Dad would break the silence with a simple, "You still thinking about it?" and I'd respond with a, "Yeah." By the time we reached Calgary, the sun was rising. We delivered the RVs as planned, went through the motions, signed the paperwork, but it all felt mechanical, distant. My mind was still back on that dark highway, replaying those 15 seconds over and over. During our break before the return trip, we sat in a diner, both of us nursing cups of coffee. Dad looked up from his phone. "Been reading about Bigfoot sightings in Banff. There've been dozens over the years, but most people don't report them officially." "Afraid of being laughed at," I said. It wasn't a question. "Exactly." He turned his phone to show me a forum of Bigfoot enthusiasts. "But there's a whole community of people who've seen something, and Liv, some of these descriptions, they match exactly what we saw." I scrolled through the posts. Tales of tall, hair-covered bipedal creatures, some aggressive, some shy. Some reported stone-throwing, strange vocalizations, or wood-knocking. But one account in particular caught my eye. A trucker who claimed to have seen a female Bigfoot carrying an infant across Highway 93, almost in the exact spot we'd seen our creatures, but 3 years earlier. "Dad, look at this one." He read it, his eyes widening. "Same location, same description. Same mother and child?" I wondered aloud. The baby would be older now, but maybe the same family group, if they're territorial like other large mammals. The waitress refilled our coffees, breaking our concentration. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," she joked. Dad and I exchanged glances. "Something like that," he replied. When she left, I leaned forward. "What do we do with this information, Dad? Do we tell someone? A researcher, maybe?" He considered this, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "If we do, we need to be prepared for ridicule. And if we lead people to them," I keep thinking about that look on her face, Liv. She was scared, protecting her baby. "Her face," I repeated. It had been so brief, but there was something in that face. Intelligence, emotion. She was just trying to cross a road with her child, going about her business until we came along. Exactly. These creatures, if they exist, and after today I'm convinced they do, they've managed to stay hidden for a reason. Maybe we should respect that. I nodded slowly. But the scientific importance, science will find them eventually, if it wants to badly enough, Dad interrupted. But it doesn't need our help to do it. We finished our coffee in silence. Outside, the city was waking up, cars honking, people rushing to work, normal life continuing, yet everything felt different now. The world had expanded somehow, become more mysterious. On the drive back to Cranbrook, we passed the spot again in broad daylight. It looked ordinary, just another stretch of highway cutting through the mountains. The snow had covered any tracks that might have remained. There was no evidence of what we'd witnessed, nothing to prove to anyone else that it had happened. But we knew. We'd both seen it clearly. A mother carrying her child through the snow, crossing a dangerous road, just trying to survive in a world increasingly encroached upon by humans. "I've been thinking," Dad said over the CB as we approached home. "Those creatures have probably been here for thousands of years. They've seen humans come and build towns, roads, railways. They've adapted, learned to avoid us. That takes intelligence. And they're teaching their young to do the same," I added. "That's what we saw. A mother teaching a child how to navigate our world safely." "Exactly. And maybe the kindest thing we can do for them is to let them be. Let them keep their secrets." So that's what we did. We kept our encounter mostly to ourselves, telling only my mother and Dad's brother Jack, who both knew us well enough to know we weren't making it up. We didn't contact researchers or media. We didn't post our story online. But we did change our routes. We started taking Highway 93 more often, always driving slowly and carefully through that stretch, especially in the early mornings. Sometimes I'd find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if she was watching us pass, that mother with her child. I never saw them again. But sometimes, on quiet drives through the mountains, when the snow is falling lightly and the world feels vast and wild, I remember those 15 seconds when the impossible became real, when a creature from legend crossed the road in front of us, reminding us that the world still holds mysteries, still harbors secrets in its dark forests and mountain shadows. And honestly, I hope it stays that way. Story 4. Saint-Chinudine. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the tent pegs, shoving them into the soft ground of Patty's backyard. The early evening air felt cool against my skin, promising the kind of clear autumn night perfect for stargazing. Patty worked beside me, hammering the stakes with confident strikes while I struggled with mine. "You're doing it wrong, Becca," she said, snatching the mallet from my hand. "Here, watch." I stepped back, brushing dirt from my jeans while surveying our campsite. Patty's backyard ended about 30 feet from her house, giving way to a dense wall of trees that marked the beginning of hundreds of acres of wilderness stretching toward the Cascade foothills. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass, the trees already dark silhouettes against the dimming sky. "Your parents are really okay with us camping out here?" I asked, eyeing the forest's edge. "Mom's fine with it. Dad's working the night shift at the mill anyway." Patty tossed the mallet aside. "Besides, we've done this 1,000,000 times." "Yeah, but usually with your brothers around too." Patty rolled her eyes. "You scared of the dark now, Becca? Or are you worried about Bigfoot coming to get us?" She wiggled her fingers in my face, making ghost noises. "Shut up," I said, shoving her hands away. "You know I don't believe in that stuff." Everyone in Morton had their Bigfoot stories. Since I was a kid, I'd heard tales from my uncles, neighbors, and even our science teacher, Mr. Peterson, about strange sightings in the forests surrounding our town. Massive footprints found along creek beds, campers hearing wood knocks echoing through the trees at night, strange human-like figures glimpsed between tree trunks that disappeared when approached. I'd always dismissed them as small-town folklore, something to make our boring little logging community seem more interesting to outsiders. "Fire's ready for lighting," Patty announced, having arranged a neat pile of kindling inside a circle of rocks. She struck a match and held it to the dry twigs. "Let's get this started before it gets completely dark." The fire caught quickly. Soon we had a decent blaze going, its orange light pushing back the gathering darkness. We dragged our camping chairs close to the warmth, and Patty produced a bag of marshmallows from her backpack. "Perfect night for ghost stories," she said, threading a marshmallow onto a stick. If you start with the one about the hook-handed man, I'm going inside, I warned. No, I was thinking more like Bigfoot stories. She gave me a mischievous grin. You know, my cousin Terry claims he saw one last summer while hiking up near Culvert Ridge. I held my marshmallow over the flames. Terry also claims he saw Elvis at the Walmart in Centralia. He said it was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and it screamed at him like nothing human. Probably just a bear, I said, focusing on rotating my marshmallow to get an even toast. Bears don't stand on 2 legs and stare at you with glowing eyes. I shrugged, trying to seem unaffected, but found myself glancing toward the darkened tree line behind her. The forest looked different at night, denser, more watchful. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. Remember what Old Man Hadley told us? About how they're actually intelligent and they watch us more than we realize. Hadley's crazy, I replied. He also thinks the government puts tracking devices in flu shots. We continued talking as the sky fully darkened, sharing stories from school and gossiping about classmates. The chirping of crickets and the crackling fire provided a comforting soundtrack to our conversation. But as the night progressed, I started feeling uneasy. At first, I couldn't identify what was bothering me. The moon rose, nearly full, bathing the yard in pale silver light. Patty was in the middle of a story about her disastrous date with Jake Thompson when I first felt it. The distinct sensation of being watched. I tried to shake it off, my imagination working overtime, sparked by Patty's earlier Bigfoot talk. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger, until the hairs on my arms stood up despite the fire's warmth. "You okay?" Patty asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah," I lied. "Just thought I heard something." She paused, listening. "Probably just raccoons. They're always trying to get into Dad's garbage cans." I nodded, but couldn't stop myself from staring into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. The forest seemed to have gone silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. "Did you notice it got quiet?" I whispered. Patty tilted her head. "Huh? Yeah, I guess it did." Then we heard it, a distinct snap of a branch breaking somewhere in the woods, not close but not far either. "Deer," Patty said quickly. "They're always around here at night." I wanted to agree, but deer moved delicately through forests. They rarely broke branches loud enough for humans to hear at this distance. We resumed our conversation, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the tree line, searching the darkness. The fire had burned down to glowing embers now, reducing our circle of light. The sound came again, another snap, closer this time. Then another and another, like something large moving deliberately through the undergrowth. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Patty nodded, her eyes wide. "Probably just—" she started, but trailed off as a deep, rumbling grunt echoed from the woods. It wasn't a bear. I'd heard bears before during camping trips with my dad. This sound was different, lower, almost human-like, but too guttural, too deep. A heavy snort followed, like something large clearing its nasal passages. "What was that?" Patty whispered, dropping her marshmallow stick. I shook my head, unable to form words. My heart hammered against my ribs. The moonlight illuminated the yard clearly now, casting everything in silver and shadow. I stared at the tree line until my eyes burned, trying to penetrate the darkness between the trunks. That's when I saw it. At first, it seemed like just another dark shape among the trees. But then it moved, stepping partially out from behind a massive pine at the forest's edge. The figure stood upright on 2 legs, towering at least 7 feet tall. Its broad shoulders and chest were covered in dark, matted hair that gleamed slightly in the moonlight. I grabbed Patty's arm, squeezing so hard she winced. "Look!" I hissed, pointing with my free hand. She followed my gaze and froze, her face drained of color. The creature stood motionless, partially obscured by shadow, but clearly visible in the moonlight. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long, reaching almost to its knees. Though I couldn't make out its face clearly, I saw its eyes, golden amber discs that caught and reflected the moonlight like a cat's. For several heartbeats, none of us moved, the creature watching us from the tree line, Patty and me paralyzed in our chairs. My lungs burned before I realized I was holding my breath. Then it shifted, taking a half step backward. The movement was deliberate, almost careful, as if it didn't want to startle us. A low grunt rumbled from its direction. "Becca," Patty whispered, her voice cracking. "What do we do?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone bone dry, my tongue stuck to the roof. Run, stay still, scream. Every option seemed equally terrible. The creature tilted its head, studying us. Its eyes never left us as it slowly, methodically stepped backward into the deeper shadows. I heard the distinct sounds of branches being pulled or pushed aside, vegetation rustling as it moved. For a moment I thought it had gone. Relief started to wash over me. Then a series of heavy thuds shook the ground beneath us. Footsteps, massive thundering footsteps, moving rapidly away through the forest. The sound of snapping branches and rustling underbrush faded into the distance. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in place, straining to hear any indication of the creature's return. Minutes, maybe. It felt like hours. "We need to go inside," Patty finally whispered. "Now." Her words broke the spell. We scrambled out of our chairs, abandoning everything, the dying fire, our marshmallows, even our backpacks. We ran toward the house, tripping over our own feet, expecting at any moment to feel massive hands grab us from behind. We burst through the back door, slamming and locking it behind us. Patty's mum was asleep on the couch, the TV still playing some late-night show. Our frantic entrance woke her. "Girls, what's wrong?" she asked, blinking sleepily. We stood in the kitchen, gasping for breath, unable to explain. What could we say? That we'd seen Bigfoot watching us from the woods? That all those crazy stories people in Morton had been telling for years might actually be true? "Just got spooked," Patty finally managed. "Thought we heard something in the woods." Her mum squinted at us. "You girls and your imagination. Probably just a raccoon or something." "Yeah," I agreed weakly. "Probably." She insisted on going out to check, grabbing the flashlight from the drawer. We watched through the window as she briefly surveyed the yard, shining the light toward the trees. Of course, she saw nothing. The creature was long gone. "Nothing there," she announced upon returning, "but you can sleep inside if you want." We nodded emphatically. Later, lying on the floor of Patty's bedroom in our sleeping bags, we finally talked about what we'd seen. "It was a bear," Patty said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Had to be." "Bears don't stand like that," I replied. "And those eyes. Could have been anything, the light playing tricks. You saw it too, Patty, it was watching us." She was silent for a long moment. "If we tell anyone, they'll think we're crazy." She was right. Even in Morton, where Bigfoot stories were practically a local tradition, actually claiming you'd seen one was different. People would laugh, or worse, think we were attention-seeking liars. "Let's just forget it happened," Patty suggested. But I knew I couldn't forget. The image of that tall, dark figure at the tree line was burned into my memory, those amber eyes intelligent and curious, observing us. The deliberate way it had moved, not aggressive, just aware. That was 3 weeks ago. Patty and I haven't talked much about it since that night. She's convinced herself it was a bear, or maybe just shadows playing tricks on our eyes. But I know what I saw. I've been researching, reading every Bigfoot account I can find. Many describe exactly what we witnessed: the height, the hair, the long arms, the glowing eyes, the sounds of wood knocks and heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Yesterday I hiked to the edge of the woods behind Patty's house alone. I didn't go in. I'm not that brave or that stupid, but I stood there for nearly an hour, just watching and listening. The forest seemed normal in daylight, birds singing, squirrels chattering. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from deep among the trees. Before leaving, I did something I can't entirely explain. I placed an apple and a candy bar on a flat rock at the forest's edge. A peace offering, maybe, or an acknowledgement. This morning, I returned. The apple and candy bar were gone, probably taken by raccoons or deer, as any rational person would conclude. But pressed into the soft earth beside the rock was a single footprint, enormous, at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, too large for any human, too defined for a bear. I didn't take a picture or tell anyone, not even Patty. Some things you just know for yourself, whether others believe you or not. The people of Morton have been telling Bigfoot stories for generations. I used to think they were just that, stories. Now I know better. There's something out there in those woods, something that watches us from the shadows, something that's been there all along, observing our campfires, listening to our stories, maybe even listening to us tell stories about them. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I won't, but another part, a growing part, hopes I will, because now I have my own Bigfoot story. And unlike all the others I've heard over the years, I know mine is true. Story 5. I jerked awake to a thud from somewhere in the house. I blinked in the darkness, disoriented at first, still getting used to our new bedroom. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. My sisters Beth and Jenny were still fast asleep in their beds across the room, their steady breathing the only sound after that initial noise. We'd only been in the house for 3 weeks. Mum and Dad had been excited to find this old place on Old Stage Road, outside Central Point. 4 whole acres, girls, Dad had announced proudly when we first drove up the gravel driveway. The house needed work, peeling paint, creaky floors and windows that stuck, but it was ours. My parents were sleeping on the hide-a-bed in the living room until they could afford proper bedroom furniture. I sat up, straining to hear anything unusual. The midsummer night was warm, and we had the windows open to catch any breeze. Outside, crickets chirped steadily. Inside, the old house made its usual settling noises. Then I heard it. A heavy footstep in the hallway outside our bedroom door. My heart jumped. Dad checking on us. But the footsteps sounded different, heavier, more deliberate than Dad's familiar tread. Our bedroom door stood partially open. From my bed, I could see a slice of the dark hallway. Another footstep, and then something moved past our doorway. Something big. I froze. Whatever it was moved past the door again, this time slower, and then it stopped. Right in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat as a massive shape filled the doorframe. The moonlight from our window cast enough light for me to make out its silhouette. It was huge, taller than Dad, taller than any man I'd ever seen. The shape stood at least 7 feet high, almost touching the top of the doorframe, and it was covered in hair. Dark, shaggy hair that hung from its arms and shoulders. I wanted to scream, but terror had stolen my voice. I gripped my sheets tightly, trying to convince myself I was dreaming. The creature turned its head toward my bed. 2 red eyes reflected the dim moonlight, glowing like embers in a face that wasn't human. Its features resembled an ape, with a heavy brow and a wide, flat nose. Those eyes locked onto mine. It saw me. It knew I was awake. For 3 long seconds we stared at each other. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The creature's massive chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Then it moved. It turned away from the door and lumbered down the hallway toward the kitchen. That broke my paralysis. I flung off my covers and scrambled across the room to Beth's bed. My legs shook so badly I nearly fell. "Beth!" I hissed, shaking my 16-year-old sister's shoulder. "Beth, wake up!" She groaned and rolled over. "Go back to sleep, Melissa. There's something in the house." My voice came out as a strangled whisper. Beth sat up, annoyed. "What are you talking about?" "A monster! By the door! It looked at me!" Beth pushed me aside and sat up. "You had a nightmare!" "No!" I grabbed her arm, my fingers digging in. "It was real. It went toward the kitchen." Maybe it was the panic in my voice or how badly I was shaking, but Beth swung her legs over the bed and stood up. "Fine. I'll prove there's nothing there, and then you're going back to bed." A new sound stopped us both. Heavy footsteps moving around the side of the house, outside. Something big walking past the exterior wall. Beth froze, finally alert. "What was that?" I pulled at her arm. "That's it. That's what I saw." We crept to the window that faced the side yard. Beth pushed the curtain aside just enough for us to peek out. A massive, hairy hand pressed against the glass. Beth screamed. I screamed. The hand disappeared as the creature moved away from the window with surprising speed. "Oh my God!" Beth whispered, backing away from the window. "What was that?" Jenny sat up in her bed, startled awake by our screams. "What's happening?" Before we could answer, Mom and Dad burst into the room, Dad wielding a baseball bat. "Girls, what's wrong?" Mom flipped on the light switch. Her hair was messy from sleep, her eyes wide with concern. Beth and I started talking at once. There was something outside the window. It was in the house first. It was huge. It had red eyes. Dad moved to the window and looked out. "I don't see anything." "It ran away," I said. "Down the driveway. It was big and hairy and had red eyes." Mom sat on Beth's bed, putting her arm around me. "Honey, you probably had a bad dream." "No!" I pulled away from her. "Beth saw it too. Tell them, Beth." Beth nodded, her face pale. "I saw something. A hand on the window. It was big and hairy." Dad walked around the room, checking the other window, looking under the beds. "Well, there's nothing here now." "We need to call the police," Beth insisted. Mom and Dad exchanged a look I knew too well. The kids are being dramatic look. "What you girls probably saw was a deer," Dad said reasonably. "They come right up to houses sometimes, especially in rural areas like this." "It wasn't a deer." I was close to tears now. "It was walking on two legs. It had a face like an ape." Mom stroked my hair. "Sweetheart, it's very dark out there. Your eyes can play tricks on you." "But I saw it in the hallway first." I pointed to the door. "It was inside the house." Dad went into the hallway, checking doors and windows. "Everything's locked up tight. No signs of entry." He came back to our room. "No deer could get inside, and certainly no whatever you think you saw." "We'll leave your light on," Mom offered. "And Dad and I will stay up for a while, just to make sure." But I could tell they didn't believe us. They thought we'd had nightmares or were seeing things that weren't there. Jenny, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. "Was it Bigfoot, like from the tabloids at the grocery store?" "There's no such thing as Bigfoot," Dad said firmly. "Now everyone back to bed. We have work to do on the house tomorrow." After they left, closing our door part way, Beth and I looked at each other. Jenny moved over to Beth's bed, and the three of us huddled together. "You really saw something?" Jenny whispered. Beth nodded. "I saw a hand, a big hairy hand on the window. That wasn't a deer." "What did you see?" Jenny asked me. "It was huge," I whispered. "Taller than Dad, covered in dark brown hair, and its face." I shuddered at the memory. Red eyes, not like human eyes. We stayed awake for hours, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Eventually, Jenny fell asleep. Just before dawn, Beth did too. I remained awake, staring at the partially open door, terrified of what might come through it. When morning finally arrived, I stumbled out of bed, exhausted but determined. While Mom made breakfast and Dad started working on fixing the back porch, I went outside to look for evidence. I checked the side of the house where the creature had touched the window. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel, baked solid by the summer heat. If there had been footprints, I couldn't see them. I walked down the driveway, searching for any sign of the creature's passage. But the driveway was mainly crushed rock. Nothing held a print. By the time I reached the road, I was losing hope of finding any evidence. At breakfast, Mom asked if I'd slept well after the excitement. "It wasn't a dream," I insisted, pushing my eggs around my plate. "Melissa, there are no monsters," Dad said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is an old house, it makes noises, and there are plenty of animals in these woods that might look strange in the dark." Beth, to my surprise, didn't back me up. When I shot her a questioning look, she just shrugged. In the daylight, perhaps she was questioning what she'd seen, but I knew what I saw. That face, those eyes, they were burned into my memory. The rest of the day passed normally. Dad worked on the house, Mom unpacked more boxes, and we girls were tasked with weeding the overgrown garden. By dinner time, no one was talking about the previous night's events. It was as if it had never happened. That night, I pushed my bed against the wall, as far from the door as possible. I kept my flashlight under my pillow and tried to stay awake, but eventually, exhaustion won out. Days passed, then weeks. Summer continued, hot and dry. We settled into our new home, and the memory of that night faded for everyone except me. School started in September. I entered 5th grade at Central Point Elementary. Making friends wasn't easy, being the new kid never is, but I gradually adjusted. I never told any of my classmates about what I'd seen. Even at 10 years old, I knew they'd think I was crazy or lying for attention. Then, in October, something happened that made my heart race. During lunch, I overheard some 6th graders talking. "My dad says they found weird footprints up by Miller's Creek," one boy said. "Huge footprints, like nothing they'd seen before." "Probably just a bear," another boy replied. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for half a mile," the first boy insisted. "And my cousin Jimmy said he saw something big and hairy crossing Old Military Road last week, right by the gravel pit." Old Military Road. That was just up from our house. I approached their table, ignoring the strange looks they gave me. "What did your cousin see exactly?" I asked. The boy shrugged. "I don't know. Something big. He said it was like an ape, but huge. He was probably making it up." My hands trembled as I returned to my lunch table. It hadn't been just me. That evening I found a newspaper on the kitchen counter. Dad had circled a small article in the local section. The headline read, "Unusual sightings continue in Jackson County." The article mentioned 3 separate reports of a large, unidentified creature in the wooded areas around Central Point and Gold Hill. One witness described seeing a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered bipedal creature crossing a road near the Rogue River. Another reported finding strange footprints near their rural property. The article quoted a local forest ranger saying these were likely misidentifications of bears or elk. Dad hadn't shown me the article. He'd probably circled it to show Mom as proof that local legends and hysteria were causing people to see things. But to me, it was validation. That night at dinner, I brought it up. "Did you see the newspaper about the Bigfoot sightings?" Mom and Dad exchanged a look. "Honey," Mom said, "those are just stories. People get excited and imagine things." "Like you imagined things," Dad added gently. "I didn't imagine it," I said stubbornly, "and neither did Beth." All eyes turned to my sister, who suddenly became very interested in her mashed potatoes. "I saw something," she mumbled. "I don't know what it was." "See?" I pointed my fork at her. "Beth saw it too." "Girls," Dad's voice took on that tone he used when ending a discussion. "There are no such things as monsters or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. Now can we please talk about something else?" The subject was closed, but my certainty wasn't shaken. Over the next few months, more sightings were reported. A group of hunters claimed to have seen a large creature moving through the woods near Table Rock. Hikers found strange hair samples caught on a barbed wire fence near the edge of our property. A local man even got a blurry photograph of something large moving between trees near the gravel pit on Old Military Road. Each new report strengthened my conviction about what I'd seen that night. Whatever had walked through our house, whatever had looked at me with those red eyes, was real. The strange thing was, despite being terrified that night, I never felt like the creature had meant to harm us. It seemed startled to find people in the house. Maybe it had been using the empty building as shelter before we moved in. Maybe it was just curious. As time passed, I became less frightened by the memory and more fascinated. I checked out books from the library about Bigfoot and other mysterious creatures. I kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about local sightings. My parents worried about my obsession, but they let it continue as long as it didn't interfere with school. Beth eventually admitted to me that she remembered the hand on the window clearly. It wasn't human, she confirmed when we were alone, but Mom and Dad would never believe us. 2 years after our encounter, our family moved again when Dad got a better job in Medford. I was 12 by then, old enough to understand why adults didn't believe in things they couldn't explain. But I never doubted what I saw that summer night in 1970. The creature, whether Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, had been real. It had walked through our hallway, looked at me with those red eyes, and then disappeared into the night. The fact that dozens of other people in the area reported similar sightings over those 2 years only confirmed what I already knew. Whatever walked through our house that night, it exists. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind rustles through trees outside my window, I wonder if it's still out there, watching and wondering about the strange creatures it encountered in that old house on Old Stage Road. Story 6. The radio crackled to life just after 2 a.m., startling me from the monotony of night duty at Fort Lewis Ammunition Dump. "Mr. Reed, Jackson, you there, sir?" The voice belonged to Tommy Wilkins, one of our youngest guards stationed at the north perimeter fence line. "Go ahead, Tommy," I replied, setting down my coffee mug. "Sir, there's—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "There's something out here, across the road. It's big, really big, standing just beyond the tree line watching me." I sat up straighter. We'd been on high alert for weeks. Intelligence had warned about potential anti-government groups targeting military installations for weapons. That's why we doubled patrols around the ammunition facility's 10-foot cyclone fence, topped with nasty barbed wire. "Describe what you're seeing, Tommy," I said, already reaching for my sidearm. "It's tall, real tall, just a silhouette. I can't—" His transmission cut abruptly. I heard what sounded like a gasp, then silence. "Tommy, come in." Nothing. "Wilkins, report." The radio remained dead. I grabbed my flashlight and was halfway to the door when it burst open. Tommy Wilkins stumbled in, his face ghost white, breathing so hard I thought he might pass out. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool April night. Most alarming, his service weapon was gone. "Jesus Christ, Tommy, what happened?" I grabbed his shoulders to steady him. "Where's your weapon?" He looked at me with eyes wider than I'd ever seen on a human face. His mouth opened and closed several times before words came out. It was right there," he gasped. "Across the road." Then it wasn't. It crossed the whole road in 3 steps. 3. Then it was standing right over me. Had to be 8, 9 feet tall. I could smell it. God, the smell. "Slow down." What was it? A person? He shook his head violently. "Not a person. No way. It was covered in hair. Dark hair." I dropped everything and ran. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. I ran." I reached for the phone to call Sergeant Holloway. Within 5 minutes, Holloway arrived with Carl Peterson, another guard from the south perimeter. Holloway took one look at Tommy and pulled me aside. "What the hell happened to him?" Holloway asked. "Claims he saw something by the north fence, something big. He abandoned his post and his weapon." Holloway's face hardened. "Damn it. We need to retrieve that gear now and figure out what spooked him." I nodded. "I'll take you both to the spot." Tommy was still shaking but managed to direct us to his post. I drove slowly, sweeping the road with the Jeep's headlights. The ammunition dump was eerily quiet at night, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to absorb all sound. "Stop," Tommy said suddenly. "It was right here." I killed the engine, but left the headlights on, illuminating a small section of the road and fence line. The three of us stepped out cautiously, flashlights scanning the area. Holloway found Tommy's rifle lying in the dirt, about 10 feet from the fence. "There's his radio too," Peterson pointed out. I walked over and picked up both items while Holloway berated Tommy about protocol and weapon security. Then I noticed something odd. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there in the mud were footprints. Not boot prints like ours. These were bare, enormous impressions sunk deep into the earth. "Sergeant," I called, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "You need to see this." Holloway walked over, annoyed until his flashlight beam hit what I was looking at. The impression was clearly a foot, but it measured at least 17 inches long. The 5 toes were clearly defined in the mud. "What the hell?" Holloway muttered. "There's more," Peterson called from a few yards away. "A whole trail of them. They come from the woods, cross the road, and—" His voice faltered as he followed the tracks with his light. "They go right up to the fence." We followed the trail together. The enormous prints showed something had approached our perimeter fence, then apparently moved along it for about 20 yards. "Look at the barbed wire," I said, pointing my light upward. Caught in the barbs about 9 feet up were dark, stringy tufts of what looked like hair. Then it hit me, the smell. A powerful, musky odor like a skunk, but heavier, more pungent. I had smelled nothing like it before. It made my eyes water. "You smell that?" I asked. Both men nodded, Peterson covering his nose with his sleeve. Tommy, who had remained by the jeep, called out shakily, "That's it. That's what I smelled." I reached up with a pen and carefully collected a few strands of the hair, placing them in my shirt pocket. As I did, I noticed the fence itself. The sturdy chain link was bent outward near the top, as if something massive had pulled on it. "Sergeant, what do we do?" Peterson asked, his earlier confidence fading. Before Holloway could answer, we heard vehicles approaching. 2 jeeps roared up, each mounted with M60 machine guns. Military police jumped out, weapons ready. "Stand down and identify yourselves!" shouted the lead officer. We explained who we were and what we'd found. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived. Men in plainclothes emerged. Army CID, the Criminal Investigation Division. They took control immediately, treating the area like a crime scene. One of them, a stern-faced man named Agent Wilson, questioned us one by one. When my turn came, he focused intensely on my description of the footprints and the hair. "And you believe this was what, exactly, Mr. Reed?" he asked. "I don't know what it was," I answered honestly, "but those prints are too big to be human, and whatever left that hair was tall enough to reach the top of our fence." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever heard reports of Bigfoot sightings in this region, Mr. Reed?" The question caught me off guard. "Bigfoot? You think that's what Tommy saw?" "I didn't say that," Wilson replied quickly. "I'm exploring all possibilities." The CID team spent the next hour taking photographs, measuring the footprints, and making plaster casts of them. They collected the hair samples, including the ones I'd put in my pocket. They examined the fence, documented the bent section, and took soil samples. As dawn approached, Wilson gathered all of us together. "Listen carefully," he said. "This incident will be documented as a suspected attempt by militants to breach the perimeter. That's what goes in your reports, understood? Nothing about unusual footprints or anything that might suggest alternative explanations." We nodded, though I could see the disbelief on Holloway's face. "One more thing," Wilson added. "This is now classified. You don't discuss this with anyone outside this group. Clear?" "Sir," I ventured, "with all due respect, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Wilson's expression didn't change. "A security incident, Mr. Reed. Nothing more." But as he turned to leave, he paused. Though if I were you, I'd recommend doubling night patrols in this section, and make sure your men are armed with something more substantial than standard sidearms. That was 3 weeks ago. We followed orders and filed reports about suspicious activity at the perimeter. Tommy requested transfer to daytime duty, which was granted without question. The hair samples, footprint casts, and photographs disappeared with the CID team. But things changed around Fort Lewis. Without official acknowledgement, our security protocols were upgraded. Guards now patrolled in pairs. The armory issued us higher caliber weapons for night duty. Motion sensors were installed along the north perimeter within days. Last night, I was supervising the midnight shift when one of those sensors triggered an alarm. Peterson and another guard, Mitchell, were closest to the area. They reported in by radio. "Mr. Reed, we're checking the north fence, section 6, Peterson said calmly. Motion sensor activated at 0130 hours. Copy that. See anything? I replied, already heading toward their position. Negative, but... Peterson paused. There's that smell again. I froze mid-step. Both of you return to the guardhouse immediately. Sir? Now, Peterson, don't argue. I radioed Holloway, who was off duty but lived on base. He arrived within 15 minutes, along with 2 MPs who'd apparently been pre-positioned nearby. You think it's back? Holloway asked privately. I don't know, but I'm not risking another incident like Tommy's. We approached the area in a jeep, headlights off, using night vision equipment that had mysteriously appeared in our security office the week after the first incident. The smell hit us before we even stopped the vehicle. That same skunky, musky odor, but stronger this time. Holloway killed the engine, and we listened. The night was unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no nocturnal birds calling. Just complete silence. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush beyond the road. Deliberate, slow. The sound of branches snapping under significant weight. I raised my night vision binoculars toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing but the green-tinted outline of trees and brush. Then something moved, something large. I caught just a glimpse, a massive silhouette walking upright, easily 8 feet tall, with long arms and a bulky frame, disappearing deeper into the forest. Did you see that? I whispered. Holloway nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. What the hell is that thing? I don't know, but it's interested in this facility for some reason. The next morning, I found a sealed envelope on my desk. Inside was a brief typewritten note. Incident classified. Continue enhanced security protocols. Report any further sightings directly to this number. Below was a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. No signature, no letterhead, just instructions. That afternoon, I checked the local newspaper. On page 12, there was a small article about strange livestock disturbances in the rural areas near the base. 3 farms had reported unusual activity. Bent fences, frightened animals, and large, unidentifiable tracks in their fields. I've been at Fort Lewis for 7 years. I've seen protesters, attempted break-ins, drunk soldiers, and even one Soviet espionage attempt. But nothing prepared me for what we encountered that night at the perimeter fence. Nothing in my training explained those 18-inch footprints, that strange hair, or the creature I glimpsed in the night vision binoculars. The official story remains that we had security incidents involving potential militant activity. Tommy Wilkins was transferred to Fort Benning last week. Peterson doesn't talk about that night anymore. Holloway and I share knowing looks when the motion sensors go off, but we follow protocol and never mention it directly. But every night when I patrol the north perimeter, I find myself scanning the tree line. My hand stays close to my weapon, which I've upgraded to a higher caliber at my own expense. I listen for heavy footsteps and sniff the air for that distinctive musky odor. I don't know what's out there in the woods surrounding Fort Lewis. I don't know why it's interested in our ammunition facility, But I know what I saw, what I smelled, and what I heard. No matter what the official reports say, something extraordinary happened here, and I have a feeling it's not over. Last night I received a call from that Washington number. A calm, official voice asked for a detailed report of any further incidents. I described the motion sensor activation and what Holloway and I had seen through the night vision equipment. The voice on the phone was silent for a moment, then simply said, "Continue monitoring. Reinforcements will arrive Tuesday." "What kind of reinforcements?" I asked. "And what exactly are we dealing with here?" "Just maintain security, Mr. Reed," the voice replied, "and keep your weapon loaded." The line went dead, leaving me with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. Whatever walked through those woods on massive feet, whatever left that strange hair on our fence and bent the metal with its strength, it was real. And for some reason, the highest levels of government wanted it kept quiet. Tomorrow is Tuesday. I don't know what kind of reinforcements are coming, but tonight I'll be on patrol again, watching the tree line, listening for heavy footsteps, and wondering what else might be out there that we've been told doesn't exist. Story 7. I jerked back on the reins as my mare, Daisy, suddenly skittered sideways on the narrow trail. Up ahead, my sister Emma's horse Jasper had also stopped dead, ears pinned back and nostrils flaring. "What's got into them?" I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence that had settled over the forest. That's when I first noticed it. The complete absence of sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the soft nickering of our increasingly agitated horses and the sound of my own breathing. My name is Sue Hollister, and my sister Emma and I have been riding these trails since we were kids. We grew up in Skamania County, where everyone knows that the thick forests hiding between Highway 30 and Skyline Drive hold their secrets. But we were experienced horsewomen. Our horses were trail-broken and steady, accustomed to bears, cougars, and whatever else these woods might throw at us. This was different. "Emma, something's wrong with Jasper," I said, watching her gelding start to circle nervously, his eyes showing white rims. Emma, always the calmer one, stroked Jasper's neck. "It's okay, boy. What's gotten into you?" I checked my watch, 3:45 p.m. We'd been riding for about an hour and a half, roughly 3.5 miles in on the trail. The woods were deep here, old-growth forest with trunks wider than tractors in some places. The path narrowed and steepened, cutting through a section where the canopy grew so thick that even on this bright spring day it felt like twilight. That's when the smell hit me. It came suddenly, an odor so powerful and foreign that my stomach clenched. It wasn't the rotting scent of a dead animal or the musky smell of bear. This was something else, heavy and primal, like wet fur mixed with something rotten and earthy, something I'd never encountered before. "Emma," I hissed, "do you smell that?" My sister's face had gone pale, her freckles standing out against her skin. She nodded, her mouth set in a grim line as she fought to control Jasper, who was now whirling in a tight circle despite her expert handling. Daisy was no better. She danced beneath me, her training forgotten as she tossed her head and tried to turn back the way we'd come. I'd been riding this mare for 7 years, and I'd never seen her spooked like this, not during thunderstorms, not when we'd encountered a mother bear with cubs last summer. "We should go back," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. I nodded, but as I tried to turn Daisy around on the narrow path, she nearly bucked. That's when I felt it, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned my head, scanning the thick underbrush and towering trees. Nothing moved, but the feeling intensified. My eyes caught something, a shadow maybe, a suggestion of movement just at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. "Emma," I whispered, "I think something's following us." She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. I could tell from the rigid set of her shoulders that she felt it too. The horse's panic escalated. Jasper reared suddenly, nearly unseating Emma despite her years of experience. Daisy was trembling beneath me, her sides heaving with each breath. "Let's go! Now!" Emma shouted, abandoning her usual calm. We didn't try to control the horses anymore. We couldn't. We gave them their heads, allowing them to bolt up the steep incline towards Skyline Drive. They needed no encouragement, surging forward with a desperate energy born of pure fear. Branches whipped at my face as Daisy thundered uphill, off the trail now, taking the most direct route to the road. I leaned low over her neck, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I could hear Jasper's hooves pounding the earth as he followed. That feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. If anything, it intensified. I risked a single glance back over my shoulder and caught, what? A blur of movement. A shadow that seemed too large, too quick to be a deer or bear. My mind refused to process it fully. The smell lingered in my nostrils, growing stronger for a moment before the wind shifted. Daisy ran faster, her fear communicating itself through the taut muscles beneath me. We broke through the tree line onto Skyline Drive with a suddenness that left me dizzy. The late afternoon sun hit my face, momentarily blinding me after the darkness of the forest. Cars whooshed past, ordinary people going about their ordinary days, unaware of what waited in the woods below. But the horses didn't stop. They wouldn't. Without discussion, Emma and I let them run all the way home, straight down our familiar routes, not slowing until they clattered into the barnyard of our family property nearly 2 miles away. We dismounted in silence, our legs shaky. The horses were lathered with sweat, sides heaving, eyes still wide with a fear that hadn't dissipated despite the distance we'd put between ourselves and whatever had been in those woods. "What the hell was that?" Emma finally asked as we led the horses into the barn. Her voice was hoarse, her usually neat braid coming undone, leaves and twigs caught in her red hair. I shook my head. "I don't know. But did you feel it? Like something was watching us?" Emma nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she removed Jasper's saddle. "I felt it. And that smell. Jesus, Sue, what smells like that?" We tended to the horses in silence after that, brushing them down, checking for injuries from our headlong flight through the woods, feeding them extra oats to calm them. By the time we finished, dusk had fallen, but neither of us suggested going back to retrieve the gear we'd dropped during our panic. A water bottle, Emma's jacket tied to the back of her saddle, those things could stay in the woods. Later that night, after a shower that couldn't quite wash away the memory of that smell, I sat at our kitchen table with a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Emma paced, her nervous energy a contrast to her usual stillness. "We should tell someone," she said. "Tell them what? That our horses got spooked in the woods?" I shook my head. "They'll think we're overreacting." "It wasn't just the horses getting spooked. It was—" Emma struggled for words. "I know," I said quietly. "But who would believe us?" The answer came to me suddenly. "Old Jim Henderson." Emma stopped pacing. "Henderson, the guy who lives at the bottom of Carpenter Hill." I nodded. "Remember how he used to tell those stories when we were kids? About things he'd seen in the woods? Adults had always shushed him, told us not to listen to crazy Jim and his tall tales. But right now, his stories didn't seem so crazy anymore. The next morning, I drove alone to Jim Henderson's place, while Emma stayed home to check on the horses, which were still jittery and off-feed. Jim's property sat at the base of the same hill system where we'd been riding, though several miles from our specific trail. His sagging farmhouse and overgrown pasture looked the same as they had when we were children, right down to the ancient pickup truck rusting in the side yard. Jim himself hadn't changed much either, still tall and lanky, though more stooped now, his face weathered from decades of outdoor work. His eyes were sharp as ever when he opened the door to my knock. "Sue Hollister," he said, recognition immediate, despite the years since we'd last spoken. What brings you to my door? I hesitated only briefly before plunging in. Jim, Emma and I were riding yesterday, up on the old trail that cuts from Highway 30 up to Skyline. Something flickered in his eyes. Come inside, he said, his voice suddenly lower. I followed him into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and bacon. He poured me a cup without asking, added cream the way I'd always taken it when I was a kid visiting with my father. His memory surprised me. Now, he said, settling his lanky frame into a chair across from me, tell me exactly what happened. I did, sparing no detail. The unnatural silence, the horse's panic, the overwhelming smell, and that persistent feeling of being watched followed. As I spoke, Jim's expression grew increasingly grim, his knuckles whitening around his coffee mug. When I finished, he was silent for so long that I began to regret coming. Then he spoke, his voice steady but quiet. I've lived on this land for 67 years, Sue. Grew up here, same as my daddy and his daddy before him. These woods, he gestured vaguely toward the window, they hold things people don't want to talk about, things they'd rather pretend aren't there. He stood suddenly, his 6'6" frame unfolding like a jackknife. Come with me. I followed him down a narrow hallway to a small room that might once have been a pantry, but now held filing cabinets and a desk buried under papers. Started keeping records in '83, he said, pulling open a drawer. After my own encounter. Your encounter, I prompted when he didn't continue, Jim's hands stilled on the files. I was checking fences in my back pasture, November evening, already getting dark. That's when I noticed the silence. He looked at me knowingly. Just like you described. No birds, no insects, nothing. Then came the smell. My skin prickled. What did you see, Jim? It was standing at the tree line, bigger than me by at least a foot, covered in dark hair, but standing upright. Not a bear, not human. Jim's voice remained matter-of-fact, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. It watched me for maybe 30 seconds. Then it was gone. Didn't run away. Just gone. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten accounts, even a few blurry photographs that showed nothing conclusive. People around here have been seeing things, experiencing things for generations, he said. Most keep quiet. Who wants to be the crazy person talking about monsters in the woods? I flipped through the material, my hands growing cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. Reports from hikers, hunters, other riders, all describing similar experiences in the forests of Skamania County. The same unnatural silence, the same distinctive odor, the same feeling of being watched by something intelligent and other. What is it? I asked, looking up at Jim. He shrugged his bony shoulders. Most folks who believe call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Scientists say it's impossible. All I know is what I saw wasn't anything known to science, and it wasn't human. I thought about the shadow I'd glimpsed, the blur of movement too quick to focus on. We never actually saw it, I admitted. Count yourself lucky, Jim said grimly. Those horses of yours probably saved you from a closer encounter. Animals know. They sense things we don't. I drove home with Jim's folder on the passenger seat beside me, my mind racing. Emma was waiting in the driveway, her face anxious. Well, she asked as I got out of the car. I handed her the folder. We're not crazy, and we're not alone. Over the next few days, we read every account Jim had collected. Some were eerily similar to our experience. Trails going silent, animals panicking, that unmistakable smell. Others described actual sightings, a massive bipedal creature covered in dark hair, moving with uncanny speed through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced hiker. We also discovered that our particular trail had a history. In Jim's records were 3 separate accounts of similar encounters along that same path, dating back to 1977. Should we report it somewhere? Emma asked one evening as we sat on the porch, the folder spread between us. I considered the question. To who? The local paper would treat it as a joke. The police would think we were wasting their time. There are research groups, Emma pointed out, people who study this sort of thing. In the end, we did file a report with a research organization that documented Bigfoot encounters. They took our information politely, added it to their database, and promised to contact us if they received similar reports from our area. We never rode that trail again. We couldn't bring ourselves to, even after the horses had calmed down. A year later, we heard that portion of the forest had been sold to a developer who planned to clear much of the old growth for a housing development. Maybe it's for the best, Emma said when we discussed it. Maybe whatever's out there will move deeper into the wilderness. But I wasn't so sure. Jim Henderson's files showed decades of encounters throughout Skamania County, across changing landscapes. Whatever was out there had been adapting to human encroachment for generations. 5 years have passed since our encounter in the woods. The development went in as planned, with luxury homes now dotting the hillside where we once rode. Emma moved to Portland for work, though she comes back often to ride the safer trails with me. I still live in our family home, still keep horses, and still ride regularly, just never alone, and never on unfamiliar paths. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of something, probably just my imagination recreating that distinctive odor from memory. But it's enough to make me check that my doors are locked, that the horses are secure in the barn. Jim Henderson passed away last winter. He left his entire collection of records to me, boxes upon boxes of encounters documented over 4 decades. I keep them in my attic, adding new reports when I hear them, and I do hear them now that people know I'll listen without judgment. Just last month, a contractor working on one of the new houses up on what used to be our trail reported tools going missing. Strange noises at night, and once, just once, catching a glimpse of something large moving between the houses after dark. The development has been plagued by construction delays and unexplained problems. I didn't tell him what Emma and I experienced on that same hillside years ago. I just nodded and added his account to Jim's files. Some things are better left undiscussed in the light of day. But I know what's out there in the shadows between the houses, in the remaining patches of forest that the developers couldn't clear. I know it's watching and waiting, as it has for generations in the woods of Skamania County. Whatever it is, it was here long before us, and I suspect it will remain long after we're gone. All we can do is stay alert, listen when the forest goes quiet, and pay attention when our horses tell us it's time to run. T. Story 8. The morning of June 12, 1947 started like any other flying day. I checked the weather at 5 a.m. Clear skies, light winds from the west. Perfect conditions for dusting the Wilkinson farm. I climbed into my old Stearman biplane while the dawn broke over the blue mountains, painting the eastern sky in bands of orange and red. The engine coughed twice before catching, then settled into its familiar rumble. My name's Nathan Taylor. Most folks around LeGrand know me as the crop duster pilot who'll fly in weather other fellas won't touch. I'd learned to fly B-24 Liberators during the war, so handling a light plane in some crosswinds didn't much trouble me. I'd planned a quick run over to the Wilkinson place, then swing north to check out some potential jobs near Mount Emily. With fuel prices what they were, I couldn't afford to make separate trips. The first 2 hours went smooth as silk. I finished dusting Earl Wilkinson's South 40 and his cornfield, making 6 passes while the morning air remained still. The chemicals laid down in perfect strips across his fields. I'd get paid well for this job, enough to cover the cost of the new propeller I'd been eyeing. Heading north to Mount Emily, I radioed back to the small airfield where I kept my plane. Should be back around noon. "Copy that, Nate. Watch those mountain downdrafts," came Hank's crackling reply. Flying low over the landscape was second nature to me. During the war, we'd sometimes drop down to treetop level to avoid enemy radar. After the war, crop dusting seemed the natural fit. I could keep flying without anyone shooting at me. Most days, anyway. I pushed the stick forward slightly and dropped to about 200 feet above the ground. The Blue Mountains spread out below me, a patchwork of dark green pines and open ridges. This close to the ground, I could spot elk herds, the occasional deer, and once even a mountain lion slinking through the undergrowth. It was one of the perks of the job, seeing the wilderness from an angle most folks never would. As I approached Mount Emily, I followed the contour of a long ridgeline with a jeep trail cutting along its spine. The Forest Service had put it in a few years back for firewatch access. Nobody much used it except rangers and the occasional hunter. That's when I saw it. At first glance, it looked like a black bear standing on its hind legs, not an uncommon sight. Bears will stand up to get a better look or smell. But something about this one immediately struck me as odd. It was tall, taller than any bear I'd seen before, and it stood perfectly still, watching my plane approach. I squinted against the morning sun. The bear didn't drop back to all fours like I expected. Instead, it turned its entire body to track my plane's path across the sky. Its movements weren't like a bear's at all, too smooth, too deliberate. "What in the hell?" I muttered, banking slightly to get a better look. The creature stood at the edge of the tree line where the forest met the open ridge. It was dark, a deep brown or black, and massive across the shoulders. From my altitude, I judged it to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. The arms hung long at its sides, far longer than a human's would. As I passed directly overhead, it tilted its head up to watch me. That's when I knew for certain this wasn't a bear. The head sat directly on those broad shoulders with hardly any neck to speak of. And the face, I couldn't make out features clearly, but it wasn't a bear's snout I was looking at. My fuel gauge caught my eye, hovering near the quarter tank mark. I had enough to get back to the airfield, but not if I circled around for another look. For a split second, I considered risking it anyway. Whatever was down there wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. But 20 years of flying had taught me one unbreakable rule: never mess with your fuel margins in mountain country. I banked the plane east and headed back, but kept my eyes on that ridge for as long as I could. The figure remained standing, watching me go, until the ridge dropped away behind me. The landing back at Wheeler Field was routine. As I taxied to my usual spot, Hank waved from beside the fuel pump. "How'd it look up north?" he called as I cut the engine. "Fine for flying," I said, climbing down from the cockpit, "but I saw the damnedest thing on Mount Emily." "What's that?" "A bear, I think, standing straight up on 2 legs watching my plane." Hank chuckled. "Bears do that sometimes. Get curious about noise." This one didn't go back down on all fours. And it was big, Hank. Biggest bear I've ever seen, if that's what it was. "Probably just the angle from up there," Hank said, already moving to refuel my plane. "Everything looks different from the air." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. After 15 years of flying over these mountains, I knew what bears looked like from above. This was something else. That evening at Mabel's diner, I mentioned it to a few of the regulars. Most of them laughed it off. "Silly old bear probably thought your plane was some big bird," said Frank Wilson between bites of meatloaf. "Maybe it was one of them circus bears escaped from a train," suggested Dot, the waitress. "I heard they teach them to walk on 2 legs. Only Jim Crater, an old logger who'd worked these mountains for 40 years, didn't laugh. He listened quietly, then asked, "Was it near that old clear-cut on the north side of Mount Emily?" "No, South Ridge, along that Forest Service road." Jim nodded slowly. "Loggers talk sometimes, about things in those woods that don't make sense. Most is just talk, but..." He shrugged and went back to his coffee. Over the next few weeks, I mentioned my silly old bear to anyone who'd listen. Most just nodded politely or changed the subject. A few asked if I'd been drinking on the job. After a while, I stopped bringing it up, but I didn't stop thinking about it. I flew over that same ridge a dozen times that summer, always hoping to spot the figure again. Never did, but each time I passed over, I remembered the way it had turned to watch me. Deliberate, intelligent, aware. Life went on. I dusted crops, flew mail runs to isolated ranches, occasionally took photographers up to capture aerial views of the Blue Mountains. The war faded further into memory, and the country settled into its new peacetime rhythm. It wasn't until 1958, 11 years later, that the memory of that day came rushing back with startling clarity. I was sitting in my living room reading the evening paper when an article caught my eye. Strange footprints found in Northern California. The article described massive, human-like tracks discovered by a road construction crew near Bluff Creek. They measured 16 inches long and showed 5 toes. Local authorities were baffled. 3 months later, the Humboldt Times ran the headline, "Bigfoot Found." The article included an interview with a logger who claimed to have seen an enormous ape-like creature walking upright through the forest. The description hit me like a punch to the gut. 7 to 8 feet tall, extraordinarily broad shoulders, powerful long arms, short neck or no neck at all. It matched exactly what I'd seen on Mount Emily in 1947. Over the next few years, more reports surfaced. A family in Washington state. Hunters in British Columbia. Each description matched the others and matched what I'd seen. They called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. In 1967, I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film footage on the local news. The creature in that shaky film, walking with that distinctive gait along Bluff Creek, sent a chill through me. The broad back, the arms swinging low, the head set directly on the shoulders. It was the same figure I'd spotted from my plane 20 years earlier. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, the creature on the ridge turning to watch my plane. I'd been one of the first to see it, years before it had a name, years before anyone was looking for it, and I'd flown away. The next morning I called Jim Crater. He was retired now, living in a small house at the edge of town. "Jim, you remember that bear I saw up on Mount Emily back in '47, the one standing on 2 legs? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I remember, Nate." "You ever hear any stories from the loggers about something like that? Something that wasn't a bear?" Another long pause. "Why are you asking now?" "Because I don't think it was a bear. I think it was one of these Bigfoot creatures they're talking about now." Jim sighed heavily. "There's things in those mountains, Nate. Always have been. The old-timers, they knew to leave certain places alone." "So you believe they're real?" "Don't matter what I believe, but I'll tell you this. In 40 years of logging, I never once set foot on the north ridge of Mount Emily after dark. Not once. The following weekend, I took my plane up again. I was 62 years old, with thousands of flying hours behind me, but this flight felt different. I had a purpose that went beyond crop dusting or mail runs. I needed to know if what I'd seen was still out there. I flew the same route as before, following the ridgeline with its now overgrown jeep trail. The landscape hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same trees, same open patches, same rocky outcroppings. For 3 hours, I crisscrossed the mountain, flying as low as I dared, scanning the tree lines and clearings. Nothing. Just the occasional deer or elk herd, startled by my plane's approach. As the fuel gauge dipped toward empty, I reluctantly turned back toward Wheeler Field. Maybe it had been a bear after all. Maybe my memory had played tricks on me over the years, morphing an ordinary sighting into something extraordinary after hearing all these Bigfoot stories. Then, on my final pass along the South Ridge, I saw movement at the edge of a small meadow. Something large and dark slipped into the tree line as my plane approached. Just a glimpse, a flash of dark fur, the suggestion of a massive figure moving with surprising grace for its size. My heart hammered in my chest. I banked hard, circling back. But whatever it was had vanished completely into the dense forest. Back on the ground, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, not even Hank. What was the point? A glimpse of movement, a shadow in the trees. It wasn't proof of anything, but I knew, the same way I'd known in 1947 that what I'd seen wasn't a bear. In the years that followed, I kept flying until my eyesight wasn't sharp enough for safe piloting anymore. I eventually sold my crop dusting business to a younger pilot, though I kept my old steerman for occasional pleasure flights. Scientists and researchers started taking the Bigfoot phenomenon more seriously. They conducted expeditions, gathered footprint casts, and interviewed witnesses. Sometimes I thought about contacting them, telling them about my 1947 sighting, one of the earliest documented encounters, years before the creature had entered public awareness. But I never did. Some experiences you keep to yourself, not because you're afraid of ridicule, but because they belong to you in a way that sharing would diminish. I'm 89 years old now. My flying days are long behind me, but on clear nights, I still sit on my porch and look toward Mount Emily, its dark shape visible against the star-filled sky. And I wonder if it's still out there. That figure I spotted from my plane all those years ago, watching, waiting, moving through those ancient forests. Sometimes I think I see movement in the distant tree line at the edge of my property. A shadow darker than the surrounding night, massive and silent. It never comes closer, never reveals itself fully. Just watches for a while, then melts back into the forest. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just an old man's eyes playing tricks in the darkness. Or maybe it remembers me too, the man in the noisy flying machine who spotted it that summer morning in 1947, when both of us were younger and the world was still full of undiscovered wonders. Story 9. The crisp November air bit at my face as I worked the knife through the deer's belly. Blood coated my hands, steaming in the cold evening light. Tommy held the flashlight steady while Buck kept watch from the truck, engine still running. We shouldn't have been there. Hunting season was closed. We were on private land, and none of us had tags anyway. But meat was meat, and the LNP logging road in Curry County was as good a place as any to poach a deer without getting caught. "Hurry up, Jed!" Tommy hissed, his breath fogging in the beam of the flashlight. "It's getting dark fast." I yanked the guts out in one slippery handful, letting them spill onto the ground. Almost done. This forkhorn ain't much, but it'll feed us for a week. The small deer carcass was lighter than I expected, my first kill of the season, though not exactly legal. The forest around us was dead quiet except for the low rumble of Buck's Ford truck idling a few yards away. We'd driven deep into the woods along the Chetco River, where the logging roads twisted through stands of pine and fir so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in. That's when Buck let out a low whistle, our warning signal. "Headlights," he called out, voice tight. "Across the North Fork." Tommy cursed, switching off the flashlight. "Game warden?" My stomach dropped. Getting caught poaching meant fines we couldn't pay, maybe jail time. I grabbed the deer carcass by its legs. "Help me hide this, quick!" We dragged the bloody deer behind a fallen log, covering it with branches and forest debris. My heart hammered against my ribs as I wiped my bloody hands on my jeans. "Let's go!" Buck yelled. "Now!" We piled into the truck, our boots caked with mud and blood. The 1958 Ford roared to life as Buck floored it, tires spinning on the dirt road before catching traction. We fishtailed around the first bend, the truck's headlights bouncing wildly across the trees. "You think they saw us?" Tommy asked from the middle seat, gripping the dashboard. "Don't matter," Buck said, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They crossed the river. They'll find our tracks easy enough." I checked the rifle at my feet. 2 shots left, used the rest on the deer. We rounded another corner at a speed that was stupid for these narrow roads. The truck's high beams cut through the gathering darkness, and suddenly Buck slammed on the brakes. The Ford skidded, throwing us forward against the dashboard. "Jesus Christ!" Buck shouted. There, caught in our headlights, was something I still can't fully explain. Something moving across the road maybe 20 yards ahead. It wasn't a deer or a bear, both animals I've seen hundreds of times in these woods. This thing stood upright, tall, 6 feet at least, walking on 2 legs, broad shoulders, powerful build. But what hit me hardest was the hair covering its entire body, coarse, matted, dark brown with tan patches. "What the hell is that?" Tommy whispered. None of us answered. The creature moved with purpose, not running but not dawdling either. Its arms swung at its sides, longer than a man's should be. The head was wrong, triangular-shaped, sitting almost directly on the shoulders with barely any neck visible. Most disturbing was how it never looked our way. Despite our truck's headlights blazing and the engine idling loudly, it never turned to face us. Just kept moving across the road and into the brush on the other side. For 30 seconds, we sat frozen, watching until it disappeared down a gully beside the road. The silence in the truck was absolute. I could hear each of us breathing. "That wasn't a man in a suit," Buck finally said, his voice cracking. I popped the door open. "What are you doing?" Tommy grabbed my arm. "Looking." My mouth was dry as dust. "Just looking." "Are you insane?" Buck hissed, but I was already stepping out of the truck. The air felt different, heavier somehow. I moved to where the thing had crossed the road, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I caught the smell. A powerful, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It turned my stomach. Then I saw them, footprints pressed deep into the soft dirt at the road's edge. Enormous prints, easily twice the size of my work boots. I bent down, holding my hand above one impression. 5 toes. Definitely not a bear. "Buck, Tommy, you gotta see this," I called, keeping my voice low. They came reluctantly, Buck bringing the rifle. When they saw the prints, Tommy let out a low whistle. "Sasquatch," he whispered. "Bigfoot." "That's just stories," I said, but without conviction. What else could explain what we'd seen? "We need to go," Buck said suddenly. "Right now." The darkness had deepened while we stood examining the prints. Night was falling fast, and the forest around us seemed to close in. I felt exposed, watched. The rifle, with its 2 remaining bullets, suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. We hurried back to the truck. Buck cranked the engine and spun us around, heading back toward the main road. No one mentioned the deer we'd left behind. None of us wanted to go back for it. We'd gone maybe half a mile when Tommy tensed up. "Listen," he said. Buck cut the engine. In the silence, we heard it. Heavy footfalls in the woods parallel to the road. Something big moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with us. "It's following us," I whispered. Buck started the truck again, pushing it faster down the narrow road. The headlights barely lit the way ahead as we rounded corners, the truck sliding on loose gravel. All the while, we could hear crashing through the brush alongside us, sometimes falling behind, then catching up with impossible speed. "Shoot at it!" Tommy yelled. I grabbed the rifle, rolled down my window, and fired a warning shot into the trees. The sound echoed through the forest, momentarily drowning out the footsteps, but seconds later, they resumed, closer now. "One bullet left," I reported, my voice shaking. We came to a fork in the road. To the right was the way back to the highway, maybe 10 miles of winding forest road. To the left was an old gravel pit, where the logging company stored equipment. "The pit," Buck decided, jerking the wheel left. "Building there. We can hole up." The gravel pit opened before us, a bowl-shaped depression cut into the hillside with steep walls rising 30 feet on 3 sides. A small corrugated metal shed stood at the far end. Buck drove straight for it, the truck bouncing over rough ground. We piled out and ran for the shed. The door was locked, but Buck slammed his shoulder against it until the old padlock broke free. Inside was empty except for some rusted tools. The single window was covered with dust. "Block the door," Buck ordered. We dragged a heavy workbench across the entrance. Tommy found an old lantern with enough kerosene to cast a weak yellow light across the small space. Outside, the night had fully arrived. The truck's headlights still burned, pointing at the gravel pit's far wall. For 20 minutes, we heard nothing. I began to think we'd imagined it all. The creature, the footsteps. Then gravel started sliding down from the top of the pit. Small rocks at first, then larger chunks. Something was moving along the rim above us. "It's circling," Tommy whispered. More gravel slid down, then a boulder that crashed into the pit floor with enough force to make the ground tremble. The thing was pacing the edge of the pit, making its presence known. I raised the rifle, my last bullet ready. "If it comes down here..." "One bullet won't stop that thing," Buck said. His face in the lantern light looked 10 years older. Hours passed. The creature continued circling. Sometimes we'd hear it move away, and hope would rise in my chest, only for the sounds to return moments later. It was toying with us. Around midnight, the truck's battery died, plunging the gravel pit into darkness, except for our weak lantern. The temperature dropped. None of us spoke much. What was there to say? I found myself thinking of old stories my grandfather used to tell. Tales of wild men in the Chetco River basin, creatures the loggers sometimes spotted but never could capture on film. I'd always thought they were just campfire tales, meant to scare kids away from wandering too far into the woods. Now I wasn't so sure. At some point, Tommy dozed off, his head resting against the shed wall. Buck kept watch through the dirty window, rifle in his lap, though we all knew it was useless with just one bullet. "What do you think it wants?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Buck shook his head. "Territory, maybe. We killed on its turf." "You think it's angry about the deer?" "I think," Buck said carefully, "these woods are older than any of us understand. And maybe we ain't the top of the food chain out here." A heavy silence followed his words. Outside, more gravel slid down the pit wall. Dawn came slowly, first as a lightening of the black to grey, then a watery sunlight filtering through the morning fog. The sounds around the pit had stopped sometime before sunrise. We waited another hour before Buck carefully pushed the workbench aside. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check." He slipped out, rifle ready. Tommy and I watched through the doorway as he surveyed the pit, looking up at the rim, then checking around the truck. After a few minutes, he waved us out. "It's gone," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. We approached the truck cautiously. The battery was dead, but we eventually got it started by pushing it down a slope and popping the clutch. No one suggested going back for the deer. We just wanted to get home. The drive back was tense, all of us scanning the woods on either side of the road. When we finally reached the highway, the relief was physical. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in hours. "We don't talk about this," Buck said as we approached town. "People will think we're crazy." "Or drunk," Tommy added. "Or both," I said. We agreed to keep it quiet. But that night, alone in my trailer, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The triangular head, the matted hair, the footprints, the way it moved with such purpose across that road without ever acknowledging us. Like we were the intruders, like we were the ones who didn't belong. A week later, I drove back out to the LNP logging road alone. I told myself I was looking for the deer we'd abandoned, but that was a lie. The carcass was gone when I found the spot, dragged away by scavengers, I assumed. But the gut pile remained, covered now with pine needles and leaves. I stood there in the silent forest, listening. Nothing moved, no birds sang. The woods felt empty in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. I left quickly, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In my rearview mirror, the dark line of trees revealed nothing. But I knew something was there, standing just beyond sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I haven't been hunting since. Neither have Buck or Tommy. Some places in these woods belong to something else, something that was here long before us. And if you're smart, you'll respect those boundaries. Because out in Curry County, along the Chetco River, where the logging roads cut through old-growth forest, you're never truly alone. And you're definitely not the hunter. You're the prey. Story 10. My name is Arthur Bax, Art to everyone who knows me. I've spent 40 years driving log trucks through every forest road in this part of Oregon. I know what's out there, or at least I thought I did until that night in late spring of 1958. It was around 11:30 p.m. when Velma and I were heading back home to Jacksonville. Our kids, Tommy and June, were conked out in the back seat of our Chevy, Tommy's head lolling against the window, June curled up with her favorite stuffed rabbit. We'd been visiting Velma's sister Martha over in Medford for dinner, stayed later than we meant to. The road was dark, winding through thick forest, my headlights carving a tunnel through the blackness. Art, don't forget we need to stop by Wilson's store tomorrow for feed, Velma said, her voice low so as not to wake the kids. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. Spring nights in these parts can be tricky. Deer come out of nowhere, and the roads get slick if there's been rain. I'd been driving these roads all my life, knew every curve and dip between Jacksonville and anywhere worth going in this county. The radio played softly, Buddy Holly singing about Peggy Sue. Our headlights caught the shine of eyes now and then. Raccoons, possums, the occasional fox. Nothing unusual, just another night drive through familiar territory. Then it happened. Art! Velma's hand shot out, gripping my forearm so hard I nearly swerved. Something massive burst from the trees on our right. I hit the brakes, the Chevy's tires skidding slightly on the pavement. The thing was in our headlights for maybe 3 seconds total, but time seemed to stretch out like taffy pulled too thin. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen in 40 years of working these forests. The creature stood upright on 2 legs like a man, but there was nothing human about it. 7 feet tall at least, maybe more, with a bulk that made it look like a walking wall of muscle and fur. Dark brown hair covered its entire body, not like a bear's fur, but longer, shaggier, hanging off its arms and back. 4 strides. That's all it took for this thing to cross the entire width of the road. 4 powerful, deliberate strides on legs as thick as fence posts. Its arms swung at its sides, unnaturally long, reaching almost to its knees. The headlights caught its profile for just a moment. A squatty, flat head that sat wrong on its neck. No real transition between shoulders and skull like you'd see on a person. Just a block of muscle rising up to a head that seemed too small for the massive body. And the smell. God almighty, the smell hit us, even with the windows rolled up. Like something rotting mixed with wet dog and skunk, so strong it made my eyes water. Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees on the left side of the road. I realized I'd been holding my breath only when my lungs started burning. The car had come to a complete stop in the middle of the road. Art, Velma whispered, her face pale in the dashboard lights. What in God's name was that? I shook my head, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I don't know. It wasn't a bear, she said. Velma had grown up in these woods too, had been hunting since she was 12. She knew every animal native to Oregon. No, wasn't a bear. In the back seat, Tommy stirred, but didn't wake. June remained curled up, oblivious. I put the car back in drive, pressing the gas pedal slowly. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept my eyes scanning the tree line on both sides of the road, half expecting the thing to burst out again. Did you see how fast it moved? Velma's voice had a slight tremble to it. In 15 years of marriage, I'd rarely heard her scared. She'd faced down a charging buck during hunting season 2 years ago without flinching. 4 steps to cross the whole road. I saw. My mouth felt dry as sand. And that smell, like those piles we've found. I knew exactly what she meant. Over the years of hunting, we'd occasionally come across strange piles of scat in the deep woods. Too big to be from any normal animal, too different to be human. The park rangers we'd mentioned it to had dismissed it as probably just a large bear with digestive issues or multiple animals using the same spot. But we knew better. No bear made droppings like that, and animals don't share communal toilets, not piles that big. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, both of us watching the darkness with new eyes. When we pulled into our driveway, I sat for a moment with the engine idling. "We don't tell anyone about this," I said finally. Velma nodded. "They'd think we're crazy." I carried Tommy inside while Velma took June. After tucking the kids in, we sat at our kitchen table, a pot of coffee between us despite the late hour. Neither of us would be sleeping any time soon. "I've been all over these forests," I said, lighting a cigarette with fingers that still weren't quite steady. "Logged every trail from here to the California border. Never seen anything like that." "It moved like it was intelligent," Velma said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "Purposeful, wasn't just wandering. You know what people would say if we told them?" She nodded. "That we saw a man in a costume, or a bear walking funny, or that we were drunk." I took a long drag on my cigarette. "But we know what we saw." "Yes." Velma looked up at me, her eyes clear and certain. "We know." I didn't sleep that night, kept hearing that thing's footsteps in my head, heavy thuds against the pavement, kept smelling that stench. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of shared hallucination. But one look at Velma's face over breakfast told me it had been real. Life went on. I kept driving my routes, hauling logs out of the same forests. But something had changed. I started carrying my hunting rifle in the truck cab, started paying more attention to the shadows between the trees, and I noticed things I'd overlooked before. 3 weeks after our sighting, I was driving a load back from the Siskiyou cutting site when I saw something odd in the mud beside the logging road. I pulled over, curiosity getting the better of me. Footprints, massive ones, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes, too big for a human, wrong shape for a bear. They led from the road into the underbrush, where broken branches showed something large had passed through. I followed the tracks for about 20 yards before my nerve failed me. Standing there in the hushed forest, I felt watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and that same putrid smell faintly reached my nostrils. I hurried back to my truck, watching the tree line the entire time. That night, I told Velma about the tracks. "I want to see them," she said immediately. "They'll probably be gone by tomorrow, supposed to rain tonight." But she insisted, so the next morning we left the kids with her mother and drove out to the logging road. Sure enough, the rain had washed away most of the evidence, but one partial print remained protected under a fallen branch. Velma knelt beside it, her expression intense. "Art, look at the depth of this." She pointed to the impression. "Whatever made this weighs hundreds of pounds." I nodded. "Heavy enough to push down this far into packed mud. We need to document this somehow." I had an old Kodak camera in the truck. We took several photos of the footprint, using my hunting knife for scale. It felt good to have some kind of proof, even if we weren't sharing it with anyone yet. Summer came, and with it longer days in the forest. I started keeping a notebook in my truck, jotting down anything unusual I noticed. Broken branches too high up for a normal animal to reach. Strange formations of rocks that seemed deliberately placed. More of those large scat piles, and twice more I found similar footprints, though never as clear as that first set. Velma did her own research, discreet inquiries at the library about local legends, taking care not to seem too interested. She learned that the local indigenous tribes had stories about wild men of the mountains going back generations. Tall, hairy beings that lived deep in the forests, occasionally taking food left as offerings, but generally avoiding humans. The librarian thought I was researching for a children's story, Velma told me one night as we sat on our back porch, watching the sun set behind the tree line. But Mrs. Blackwood, you know, who works at the post office. Her grandmother was half Takelma. She overheard me talking to the librarian and later told me her grandmother used to leave berries at the edge of their property for the forest people. Did she ever see one? I asked. She said her grandmother claimed to have seen them 3 times in her life, described them just like what we saw. I felt a chill despite the warm evening. So these things have been here all along. Seems that way. In August, something happened that made keeping our experience secret much harder. Tommy, now 7, came running into the house one afternoon, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Mom, I saw a giant monkey man in the woods." My blood ran cold. Velma and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean, honey?" Velma asked, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "Me and Billy Wilson were playing by the creek, and I saw something watching us from the trees. It was huge and hairy, like a giant monkey standing up." "Did Billy see it too?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, though my heart was racing. Tommy shook his head. "No, he was skipping rocks. When I told him, he looked, but it was gone. He said I made it up." His face fell. "He called me a liar." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You're not a liar, Tommy, but sometimes people see things others don't believe in." "So you believe me?" His eyes widened with hope. I hesitated, looking at Velma. She gave a small nod. "Yes, son, I believe you." I sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for him to join me. "Your mother and I saw something similar a few months back." We told him a simplified version of our encounter, emphasizing that we hadn't told anyone because sometimes people don't understand things that are different or unexpected. Tommy listened with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting with questions. "So it's like a secret?" he asked when we finished. "For now," Velma said. "People might make fun of us if we talk about it too much. Like Billy did to me." "Exactly." Tommy nodded solemnly. "I won't tell. But can we try to see it again? On purpose?" That question led to family camping trips that were really excuses to venture deeper into the forests around Jacksonville. We never told anyone what we were really looking for. To the outside world, we were just an outdoorsy family that enjoyed nature. For over a year, we had no further sightings, though we continued to find indirect evidence, more footprints, strange structures of broken branches high in trees, areas where vegetation had been clearly pushed aside by something large moving through. Then, in October of 1959, everything changed again. I was working a new logging route near the California border, an area that hadn't been heavily cut before. The forest there was old, the trees massive, the underbrush thick. Something about the place felt different, quieter, more watchful. On my 3rd day working that route, I was loading the last logs of the day when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. I straightened slowly, turning in a casual circle as if checking my load, but really scanning the tree line. There, between 2 massive Douglas firs about 50 yards away, stood a figure. Not the same one we'd seen on the road. This one was slightly smaller, maybe 6.5 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair instead of dark brown. It stood perfectly still, watching me. I froze, one hand on the chain securing the logs. For what felt like minutes but must have been seconds, we stared at each other. I could make out more details this time. A broad, sloping forehead, deep-set eyes, a mouth set in what looked like a permanent frown, arms hanging at its sides, massive hands with long fingers. Then I did something I still can't explain. I raised my hand slowly and waved. The creature's head tilted slightly, an eerily human gesture of curiosity. It didn't wave back, but it didn't flee either. After another long moment, it took a step backward, still watching me. "I won't hurt you," I said, my voice sounding strange in the quiet forest. The creature took another step back, then turned with surprising grace and moved deeper into the forest, quickly disappearing among the trees. I sat in my truck for a long time after that, hands shaking on the steering wheel. This encounter had been different. No fear, no panic, just an odd moment of connection with something I couldn't explain. When I told Velma that night, she listened intently, asking detailed questions about its appearance and behavior. "You think there are more than one of them?" she said. It wasn't a question. Has to be. This one was different from what we saw last year. Smaller, different coloring. A female, maybe. I shrugged. Could be. If there are multiple individuals, different sizes... Velma trailed off, her expression thoughtful. "Art, we might be dealing with an entire species, not just some strange anomaly." The thought was both exciting and unsettling. If these creatures were real, an undiscovered species living in our forests, what did that mean? How had they remained hidden for so long? How many were there? Over the next few months, I had 2 more distant sightings in that same area. Never close encounters, always just glimpses through the trees. I started leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing where I worked. Apples, occasionally a sandwich, once a candy bar. The food always disappeared when I wasn't looking. In December, I found a stack of 3 small logs placed neatly beside my truck while I was working further down the road. They hadn't been there when I parked. They were arranged too deliberately to be coincidence or natural occurrence. I took one of the logs home, showing it to Velma. "They're communicating," she said, turning the log over in her hands. "Mimicking what you do. You stack logs, they stacked logs." By 1960, we had compiled a small collection of evidence. The photographs of footprints, my notebook full of observations, a folder of newspaper clippings Velma had gathered about strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest, dating back decades. Then, in 1967, everything changed. The Patterson-Gimlin film hit the news. A short, shaky video allegedly showing a large, upright-walking, ape-like creature in Northern California. Suddenly, Bigfoot was a household name, the subject of documentaries, books, and endless speculation. Velma and I watched the coverage with mixed emotions. On one hand, it validated what we'd experienced. On the other, it transformed our private encounters into something sensationalized, the subject of ridicule and hoaxes. "Should we come forward?" Velma asked one night, as we watched a news segment featuring a man claiming to have captured a Bigfoot in his barn. It was clearly a man in a suit. I considered it. What would be the point? Look at this circus. No one's taking it seriously. But we know the truth. "Yes," I said, taking her hand. "We do. Maybe that's enough." We never did share our story publicly. Tommy grew up and occasionally told friends about his childhood encounter, usually met with good-natured ribbing. June, who had slept through our original sighting, became fascinated with the subject as a teenager, not realizing her parents had first-hand experience until we finally told her when she was 16. I continued driving logging routes until my retirement in the late 1980s. In all those years, I had perhaps a dozen more sightings, each one brief, always at a distance. The creatures, I came to believe there were at least 5 distinct individuals in our area, seemed to recognize my truck over time, occasionally revealing themselves momentarily before melting back into the forest. Velma and I kept our record, adding to it over the years. It sits now in a file box in our attic, alongside the faded photographs of footprints and my old notebooks. Sometimes I go up there and look through it all, remembering that night in 1958 when the world as I understood it changed forever. I'm an old man now. Velma's been gone 3 years. The forests I once drove through daily are changing. More roads, more houses, fewer places for secrets to hide. I wonder sometimes if they're still out there. Those creatures that move through the trees like shadows. I wonder if they remember the man who left them apples and waved hello. I may never know, but I know what I saw, what Velma saw. I know what's out there in the deep woods of Oregon, walking on 2 legs, watching from the shadows. I know, and that knowledge has made my life richer, more mysterious, and infinitely more interesting than I ever expected it to be. Story 11. The screeching started at 8:42 p.m. I remember checking my watch when we first heard it. Mum had just brought out a pitcher of sweet tea to the porch, and Dad was lighting his evening pipe. My little sister Emma had already gone to bed, thankful to be spared whatever unholy noise tore through the quiet evening air around our cabin. "What in God's name is that?" Dad muttered, his match still burning between his fingers until it singed him. "Damn!" He shook out the match and stood up, walking to the edge of our porch. I stood beside him, listening as another screech cut through the night. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard around Penn, not a cougar, not a bear. It was higher pitched, but somehow deeper at the same time, like it came from something with a massive chest cavity, but a throat that narrowed to a point. "Ethan, go inside with your mother," Dad said, his voice tight. "But now, son." I didn't argue. At 16, I'd learned when to push back against my father and when to listen. This was a listen moment. The screeching continued all night, sometimes close, sometimes far away, like whatever made the sound was circling our property. I lay in bed, the window cracked open despite the late summer chill, and listened until I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m. The next morning, I woke to silence. Dad had already left for work at the lumber mill, and Mom was making breakfast, acting like nothing had happened. When I asked about the noises, she just shrugged. "Probably some animal in heat," she said, flipping pancakes. "Your father said not to worry about it." But I did worry. I'd lived in these mountains my whole life. I knew every sound these woods made. This was something new, something different. After breakfast, I told Mom I was going fishing at Bead Lake, grabbed my rod and a small pack with lunch, and headed out. I did bring my fishing gear, but I had no intention of casting a line that day. I wanted to find whatever made those sounds. The hike to Bead Lake normally took about 40 minutes from our cabin, but I wasn't heading straight there. I walked in the direction I thought the screeching had come from, up toward the ridge that separated our valley from the next. The August sun filtered through the pine trees, warming the forest floor in patches. The smell of sun-baked pine needles filled my nostrils as I climbed higher. After about an hour of hiking, I stopped to catch my breath at a small clearing. That's when I noticed it, a tree stump with rocks stacked on top. Not just tossed there by chance, but deliberately placed. 6 rocks of different sizes and colors sat in a tight group on the flat surface of the stump. The bottom rock was large and reddish, about the size of a softball. On top of that sat a white quartz stone, then a smaller black stone, followed by 3 pebbles in graduating sizes. Gray, green, and a speckled one on top. I approached the stump and examined the rock formation. It didn't look natural. Someone had placed these rocks here, and recently too. There was no dust or pine needles on them. Looking around, I spotted another stump about 30 yards away. I walked over and found the same thing, a different arrangement of rocks, but clearly placed with intention. 7 rocks this time, starting with a flat grey stone at the bottom. I spent the next several hours hiking along the ridge, finding a total of 11 stumps with rocks carefully placed on top. They formed a rough line along the ridge, spaced irregularly, but generally following the contour of the land toward Bead Lake. Curiosity got the better of me. At the 6th stump I found, I removed the rocks and set them on the ground next to it. I did the same at the next 2 stumps. I wanted to see if anyone would notice. If these were trail markers for hikers, someone might replace them. If they were just some kid's project, they'd probably stay disturbed. By late afternoon, I had to head back home. I made a mental note of where I'd found the stumps and planned to return in a few days to check on them. At dinner that night, I asked Dad if he knew anything about rock formations on stumps up on the ridge. "What were you doing up on the ridge?" he asked, eyebrows furrowed. "I thought you were fishing." "Just exploring," I said, pushing peas around my plate. Mom looked concerned. "You know better than to go up there alone, Ethan. There are drops on the other side that go straight down 200 feet. I was careful," I assured her. "But did you ever see rocks stacked on stumps up there?" Dad shook his head. "Probably just kids from town messing around. The Marshall boys like to hike up there sometimes." I nodded, but I didn't think it was the Marshall boys. They were troublemakers who liked to shoot at squirrels and carve their initials into trees. This felt different, more purposeful. That night, the screeching started again, this time around 9:30 p.m. It sounded farther away but still unsettling. I caught Dad looking at his rifle cabinet more than once before bed. A week passed before I could get back up to the ridge. Football practice had started, and Coach Jenkins ran us into the ground every afternoon. But Saturday came, and I told my parents I was going fishing again. Dad was busy fixing our truck, and Mom was taking Emma into town for new school clothes. "Be back before dark," was all Dad said, his head still under the hood of the truck. I headed straight for the ridge this time, moving quickly through the familiar forest. When I reached the first stump, I stopped dead in my tracks. The rocks were back, arranged exactly as they had been before I removed them. I checked the ground where I'd left them. Nothing there. Heart pounding, I jogged to the next stump. Same thing, all the rocks I'd disturbed were back in place, in the same configuration as before. I checked every stump I'd found the previous week, and every single one had its rocks restored to their original positions. Someone had noticed. Someone had come back and fixed what I'd disturbed. But who and why? I continued along the ridge, finding 4 more stumps with rocks that I hadn't discovered on my first trip. The pattern extended all the way to where the ridge sloped down toward Bead Lake. This time, I decided to be more methodical. I took a small notebook from my pack and sketched each rock formation, noting its location as best I could. Then I removed the rocks from 3 widely separated stumps, making sure to place them in different locations, some hidden under nearby bushes, some in a small creek, and some I tossed down the steep side of the ridge. As I worked, the forest seemed to grow quieter. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering. Just the sound of the breeze through the pines and my own breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up more than once, that feeling you get when you think someone's watching you. I kept looking around, but saw nothing unusual. I made my way down to Bead Lake and actually fished for an hour, catching 2 small trout that I released. I needed to have something to show for my day if Dad asked. For the next 3 years, this became my obsession. Every chance I got, I'd check on the rock formations. Every time I disturbed them, they would be restored within a week. I expanded my search area, finding similar arrangements near Marshall Lake, about 5 miles from Bead Lake. The rocks were always different, but the pattern was the same. 6 or 7 colorful stones of various sizes placed on top of flat stumps. In the fall of 1963, I had my most unsettling experience. I'd graduated high school that spring and was working at the mill with Dad, saving money for college. One Saturday in October, I hiked up to the ridge alone. The air was crisp and the leaves had started to turn. It would be winter soon, and I wondered if the rock formations would continue through the snow. I had just reached the 3rd stump and was sketching the latest rock arrangement when that feeling of being watched intensified. The forest had gone dead silent. Not even the wind moved. Then I smelled it, a powerful stench that hit me like a physical force. It was like a wet dog that had rolled in a dead deer carcass and then baked in the sun. I gagged, covering my nose with my shirt. That's when I heard the breathing, deep, raspy breathing, coming from the dense underbrush about 50 yards away. I froze, my pencil suspended above my notebook. Something large shifted in the brush. I caught a glimpse of movement, something tall and dark moving behind a cluster of pines. I didn't wait to see more. I shoved my notebook in my pocket and ran, not back toward home, but down toward Bead Lake, where there might be other people fishing. I ran faster than I ever had in football practice, jumping over fallen logs and ducking under branches. The whole time, I heard something moving parallel to me, just out of sight in the thicker parts of the forest. Whatever it was keeping pace with me easily. When I reached the lake, I burst out onto the shoreline, breathing hard. An old man was there with his rowboat, getting ready to head out onto the water. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You okay, son?" he asked, setting down his tackle box. I looked back at the tree line. Nothing there now. The forest had returned to its normal sounds, birds chirping, squirrels scolding. The smell was gone too. "Yeah," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Just thought I saw a bear." The old man nodded knowingly. "Lots of black bears around here. Best to make noise when you're hiking so you don't surprise them." I stayed at the lake until the old man offered me a ride back to town in his truck. From there, I walked the road home, unwilling to cut through the forest again. That night, the screeching returned, louder than ever. Dad took his rifle and sat on the porch all night. By morning, he was bleary-eyed, but insisted he hadn't seen anything. "Just coyotes," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. 2 weeks later, I got up the courage to return to the ridge. I found all the stumps undisturbed, rocks exactly as they had been. But I also found something new. Bare tunnels through the underbrush, about 3 feet tall, like something had crawled through on all fours, and bigger tunnels through the higher brush, 7 or 8 feet off the ground, as if something very tall had pushed through. I followed one of these tunnels for about a quarter mile until it led to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a pile of bones, deer mostly by the looks of them, with a few smaller animals mixed in. The bones had been picked clean, not a scrap of meat left on them. They were arranged in a rough circle, with the skulls forming an inner ring. I backed away slowly and returned home. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Over the decades, I've continued to check on the rock formations, though less frequently as life took me away from Penn. I went to college, got married, had kids of my own, but I always came back to visit my parents, and later, after they passed, to check on our old cabin, which I kept as a vacation home. Every time I return, I hike up to the ridge. Every time, the rock formations are there, though the specific arrangements change. Sometimes I remove them, just as I did when I was 16, and without fail, when I return, they're back in place. Different rocks, different patterns, but always 6 or 7 stones stacked on the stumps. It's 2022 now. I'm 76 years old, my knees aren't what they used to be, and climbing that ridge takes me twice as long. But I still go. My grandkids think I'm crazy, hiking alone at my age. My wife gave up trying to stop me years ago. Last summer I took my oldest grandson, Jake, with me. He's 16 now, the same age I was when this all started. I showed him the stumps, the rocks. He was interested but skeptical. "So you think Bigfoot is making these?" he asked, smirking a little. I shrugged. "I don't know what's making them. I just know they keep coming back." To humor me, Jake helped remove the rocks from 5 stumps. We placed them in a small stream, watching as the current carried them away. 1 week later, I convinced Jake to hike back up with me. His eyes widened when he saw the fresh rocks on each stump, arranged in new patterns. "Maybe someone's messing with you, Grandpa," he suggested. "Someone who knows you check these stumps." "For 60 years, I asked. He had no answer for that. As we hiked back down toward Bead Lake, I heard Jake stop suddenly behind me. "Grandpa," he whispered, "do you smell that?" I turned and saw his face, pale and confused, and then I smelled it too, that unmistakable stench of wet dog and death. Jake's eyes moved to something behind me, something up in the tree line above us. I turned slowly, following his gaze. For just a moment I saw it clearly. Tall and massive, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, standing upright between 2 large pines. It was at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of a pronounced brow and a wide mouth. It stood perfectly still, watching us. Jake raised his phone to take a picture, but by the time he had it ready, the figure was gone, moving with surprising speed and silence through the forest. "Did you see that?" Jake's voice shook. "What was that?" "That," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected, "is what's been stacking rocks for 60 years. We made our way back to the cabin quickly, not running but not dawdling either. Jake was quiet the whole way, processing what he'd seen. That night, we heard the screeching again, just like I had when I was his age. I don't know if what we saw was a Bigfoot or some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I know it's intelligent. I know it communicates using those rock formations, maybe marking territory, maybe indicating food sources, maybe something I can't begin to understand. And I know it's been watching me for 60 years, just as I've been watching it. It's been playing this strange game with me, this back and forth with the rocks. Sometimes I wonder if it sees me as a threat, or if it's just curious about the human who keeps interfering with its markers. Next summer, I'll go back again. I'll check the stumps. I'll remove the rocks. And when I return, they'll be there waiting for me, rearranged by whatever shares these woods with us. It's a conversation of sorts, carried out in silence across the decades. And somehow, I think we both understand exactly what's being said. Story 12. The summer heat was making my shirt stick to my back as Mike and I hauled our inner tubes up the dirt path. It was 1966, and at 13, the Marble Mountain Wilderness was our playground. We'd spent the afternoon floating down the Salmon River, but now the sun was getting low, and we needed to get back to camp at Jones Beach before dark. My arms ached from carrying the rubber tube, and sweat dripped into my eyes. "Hurry up, Lucas," Mike called from ahead of me on the trail. "Your mom's gonna have dinner ready, and I'm starving." I was about to answer when movement across the river caught my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Mike!" I hissed. "Look over there." At first, I thought it was a bear emerging from the tree line on the opposite bank. Bears weren't uncommon in this part of Northern California, but something wasn't right about this one. As I squinted across the distance, maybe 100 yards, I realized what was wrong. It was walking upright. Not just for a few steps like bears sometimes do, but continuously, deliberately, like a man. Except it wasn't a man. Not unless men in these parts grew to 7 or 8 feet tall and covered themselves in dark, matted hair. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, dropping his inner tube. From our elevated position on the trail, we had a clear view as the thing walked to the edge of the river. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, and looked to weigh 400 or 500 pounds. Its body was covered in brownish-black hair that hung in shaggy patches. The late afternoon sun caught its outline, making it stand out against the trees behind it. "Is that—" Mike couldn't even finish the sentence. "Bigfoot," I said, the word barely making it past my dry lips. The creature seemed unaware of us watching from across the river. It crouched down at the edge of the water, and I could see its massive arms extend. Then it did something so human it sent chills down my spine. It cupped its hands into the river and brought water to what I assumed was its mouth. It repeated this motion several times, drinking just like a person would. My heart hammered in my chest. The thing was less than a football field away from us. If it looked up, it would see us standing there, frozen in place. After drinking its fill, the creature straightened up, still seemingly oblivious to our presence. Then it turned and walked back into the dense tree line, disappearing from view with surprising quickness for something so large. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Yeah," Mike nodded, his face pale. "We gotta tell everyone." We abandoned all thoughts of taking our time. Grabbing our inner tubes, we ran the rest of the way up the trail, stumbling and tripping in our haste. My lungs burned, but fear and excitement pushed me forward. When we burst into camp, words tumbled out of our mouths simultaneously. "We saw Bigfoot!" I shouted, dropping my tube and rushing to where my parents sat around the campfire with Mike's family and a couple other campers. "It was huge," Mike added, gesturing wildly with his hands, "like 8 feet tall." "It was drinking from the river, using its hands," I continued. The adults exchanged glances. My father chuckled. "Slow down, boys," he said. "What exactly did you see?" We told them everything. How it walked upright, its massive size, the brownish-black hair covering its body, how it drank from the river before returning to the woods. "Probably just a bear," Mr. Jenkins said, poking at the campfire with a stick. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long," I insisted. "And it had arms and legs like a person, not a bear." "Your imagination's running wild," my mother said, ruffling my hair. "You boys have been telling those Bigfoot stories all summer." "But, Mum, we really saw it," I protested. "Sure you did," Dad said with a wink. "Now wash up for dinner." No matter how much we insisted, none of the adults believed us. They patted our heads, smiled indulgently, and changed the subject. Mike and I spent the rest of the evening whispering about what we'd seen, sketching pictures in the dirt with sticks, and vowing that someday we'd prove Bigfoot was real. I never forgot that day. The image of that creature burned itself into my memory. The deliberate way it moved, those massive hands cupping river water, the sheer size of it against the backdrop of trees. As I grew older, I became less vocal about what we'd seen. People in town already thought I was the kid with an overactive imagination. No need to add fuel to that fire, but I knew what I'd seen, and nothing would change that. 8 years passed. I was turning 21, and to celebrate, I planned a camping trip back to Jones Beach with my new wife Kathy and my buddy Emmett. Mike had moved away years ago, but I'd never stopped thinking about our encounter. Part of me hoped lightning might strike twice. "I still don't understand why you want to spend your 21st birthday camping instead of hitting the bars," Emmett said as we drove along the winding road toward the Marble Mountain wilderness. It was 1974, and Emmett's beat-up Ford pickup groaned with each curve. "Lucas has been talking about this place since we met," Kathy said from the middle seat, squeezing my hand. "Says it's the most beautiful spot in California." I didn't tell them the real reason. Kathy knew about my Bigfoot story. She'd laughed when I first told her, thinking it was a joke. Emmett would have given me even more grief than he already did about everything else. We arrived late, setting up camp in the dark. The next day was spent hiking, swimming, and cooking over the campfire. My birthday came and went, with a small celebration, a few beers, and no sign of anything unusual in the woods. The real excitement came 2 nights later. We'd driven into the nearest town for supplies, and were heading back to camp well after midnight. I was behind the wheel of Emmett's truck, with Kathy beside me and Emmett half asleep in the passenger seat. The headlights cut through the darkness of the rural road, illuminating just a few yards ahead at a time. "Watch out!" Kathy suddenly screamed, grabbing my arm. I slammed on the brakes as something huge stepped onto the road about 30 yards ahead. The truck skidded slightly, and Emmett jerked awake. "What the hell?" he muttered, then froze as he looked through the windshield. There in the headlights stood a creature straight out of my 13-year-old memories. It was enormous, standing upright on 2 legs, its massive body covered in dark hair. But what made my blood run cold was what it was carrying. A 50-gallon garbage drum tucked under one arm like it weighed nothing. A chain that had once secured the drum to a post dragged behind it, scraping on the asphalt. "Oh my God," Kathy whispered, her fingernails digging into my arm. The creature turned its head toward us, and the headlights caught its eyes. An eerie yellowish tint reflected back at us. For a moment, it stood there, staring. Then, with surprising speed, it stepped off the road and disappeared into the woods, taking the garbage drum with it. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Did you both see that?" "What the fuck was that thing?" Emmett's usual confident tone was replaced with one of disbelief. "Bigfoot," I said. "That's what Mike and I saw when we were kids. That's exactly what it looked like." "No way," Emmett shook his head. "No fucking way." "It had a garbage can," Kathy said, her voice small. "It was carrying a garbage can, Lucas." I slowly released the brake and drove forward. When we reached the spot where the creature had crossed, I stopped the truck and turned to the others. "We need to check this out." "Are you insane?" Emmett protested. "You want to go looking for that thing in the dark?" "Not tonight," I said. "But tomorrow morning, we need to see if there's any evidence." "I saw it too," Kathy said quietly. "If we don't look, no one will believe us." Emmett reluctantly agreed, and we continued to camp in silence. None of us slept well that night. Every sound from the woods made us jump. The next morning, we drove back to the spot. In the daylight, the evidence was clear. A wooden post had been ripped from the ground where the garbage drum had been chained. White marks from the concrete base of the post made a trail across the road, showing exactly where the creature had walked. "Jesus!" Emmett whispered, staring at the scene. We followed the trail into the woods. About 50 yards in, we found where the creature had taken the drum. It had been smashed open, garbage scattered around. But what hit us immediately was the smell. A putrid stench like an open sewer mixed with something musky and animal. "That's the most disgusting thing I've ever smelled," Kathy said, covering her nose with her shirt. Emmett, who'd been the biggest skeptic, stood silent for a long moment, looking at the destruction and the large, unusual footprints in the soft earth around the garbage. "No bear did this," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't a bear." We took photos with Kathy's camera, measured the footprints using sticks, and noted everything we could about the scene. The footprints measured nearly 16 inches long and showed a distinct human-like shape, 5 toes, a ball, and a heel, but much wider than any human foot. When we returned to town and told our story, showing the photos, people actually listened. The garbage drum incident was hard to explain away. The park ranger confirmed that the post had indeed been installed in concrete and would have taken considerable strength to uproot. Several locals admitted to hearing stories of similar creatures in the area for generations. For the first time since I was 13 years old, people didn't dismiss my story outright. The skeptics still existed, of course. Some suggested pranksters in suits, others proposed escaped zoo animals. But those who came to see the site, who smelled that distinctive odor and saw those massive footprints, they left with questions they couldn't answer. As for me, I no longer needed convincing. I'd seen the creature twice now, 8 years apart in the same region. The second sighting had validated what Mike and I experienced as kids. Whatever lived in the Marble Mountain wilderness, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. Kathy and I returned to those woods many times over the years. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes, deep in the wilderness, we'd catch that distinctive smell or hear strange vocalizations that didn't match any known wildlife. Once, we found a footprint by a stream that matched what we'd seen before. People ask me if I'm afraid, knowing such a creature exists in those woods. The truth is, it had 2 chances to harm us and didn't. That thing, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it, seemed more interested in going about its business than in human interaction. In all the stories I've heard from others who've had encounters, very few involve aggression. I still camp in those woods. I still float down that river. And sometimes, when I'm sitting by the campfire at night, I feel eyes watching from the darkness. I don't shine my flashlight toward that feeling anymore. Some things in this world deserve their privacy, their mystery. That creature has as much right to those woods as we do, probably more. But I know what I saw. both times, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Story 13. The rain had finally stopped when I pulled my pickup onto the logging road that would take me to Ray's fire watchtower. I'd known Ray since high school, back in Millerville, and when he'd called saying he needed someone to visit, there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Fear. The forest closed in around me as I drove deeper into Mount Baker National Forest. October 1979 was turning out wetter than usual, and patches of fog hung between the massive trees. My truck bounced over ruts in the muddy road, splashing through puddles the size of small ponds. I spotted Ray's camp trailer first, a silver Airstream parked in a small clearing beside the tower. Something about it looked wrong. As I got closer, I realized what it was. Dents. Dozens of them, pockmarking the metal sides like some giant had used it for batting practice. Ray emerged from the trailer door before I'd even cut the engine. He looked like hell, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, hair unwashed. Not the Ray Wilson I remembered. "Tyler, thank God you made it." His voice cracked as he rushed to my truck. I stepped out, boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. "Jesus, Ray, what happened to your trailer?" Ray's eyes darted to the surrounding tree line. "Let's talk inside." I grabbed my duffel from the truck bed and followed him. The interior of the trailer was warm but cluttered. Empty coffee cups everywhere, dishes in the sink, maps spread across the small table. But what caught my eye were the windows. Most had been covered with what looked like plywood, nailed hastily in place. "You want coffee?" Ray asked, already pouring some into a chipped mug. "Sure." I took it, feeling the warmth spread through my cold hands. "Now you want to tell me what's going on? Your trailer looks like it got caught in a hailstorm, and what's with the windows?" Ray sat heavily on the small bench seat. "You won't believe me. Try me." He took a deep breath. "It's Bigfoot." I stared at him. "What?" "A family of them, living in these woods." His hands trembled slightly as he raised his mug. "They throw rocks at my trailer every night. They want me gone." I laughed, but it died in my throat when I saw his expression. "Ray, come on. Sasquatch. Seriously." He stood abruptly, motioning for me to follow. Outside, he pointed to the ground surrounding the trailer. Rocks, hundreds of them, littered the clearing. Not small pebbles, but fist-sized rocks that would leave serious dents if thrown with force. "Where'd all these come from?" I asked. "Them." He gestured to the dense forest. "They throw them every night. Sometimes they hit the trailer, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just stand out there and watch me." "Ray, there's got to be a logical—" "No." He cut me off. "I know what I've seen, Tyler. I've been up here 3 months. It started with noises, wood knocking, whistles, then rocks. Then I started seeing them, just glimpses through the trees. Big, way bigger than a man. And the smell." He shuddered. "Like nothing you've ever smelled before." Inside again, Ray pulled out a bottle of whiskey from under his bunk. We each took a shot before he continued. "Ranger came by last week. I told him everything. Know what he said? Said I wasn't the first. Said they've had trouble keeping staff at this outpost for years. People request transfers after a few months." I rubbed my face. "So what helped you pack up?" "No." Ray leaned forward. "I need someone else to witness this. Someone to tell me I'm not going crazy. Just one night. That's all I'm asking." The rational part of my brain screamed that my friend had lost it out here alone in the woods. But something in his eyes, that raw fear, made me nod. "One night?" I agreed. We spent the rest of the daylight hours preparing. Ray showed me his shotgun, a 12-gauge pump action, and pulled out my old .30-30 hunting rifle from the storage compartment. "You brought this?" I asked, surprised to see my rifle that I'd loaned him years ago for a hunting trip. "Never returned it," he admitted. "Good thing, too." We loaded both weapons and placed them within easy reach. Then Ray handed me a hammer and some plywood, and we covered the remaining windows. By the time we finished, the trailer felt like a bunker, claustrophobic but secure. Night fell early in the forest. We ate a dinner of canned stew heated on Ray's propane stove, washing it down with more whiskey than was probably wise. The alcohol helped take the edge off my nerves, but Ray remained tense, jumping at every sound outside. "They won't start until after midnight," he said. "They never do." We tried to distract ourselves with cards, but Ray's constant glances toward the door made concentration impossible. By 11:30, we'd given up and just sat in silence, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, wind through trees, occasional drops of water from the branches, distant hoots of owls. I must have dozed off sometime after midnight, slumped awkwardly on Ray's tiny couch. The sound that woke me sent ice through my veins. Crack, a tree limb breaking, not the gentle snap of a small branch, but the violent fracture of something substantial. Ray was already up, shotgun in hand, eyes wide. "They're here," he whispered. I grabbed my rifle, checking that it was loaded. Maybe it's just thunk. The first rock hit the side of the trailer, making the whole structure shudder, then another and another. A barrage that sounded like hail on a tin roof, except these were heavy, deliberate impacts. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. Ray just nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. "Told you." We huddled in the center of the trailer, away from the walls. The attacks seemed to come from different directions, first one side, then another, as if multiple attackers were coordinating. Then came a new sound, a low, guttural grunt. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any animal I'd ever heard in my years of hunting the Washington forests. It was followed by another grunt, higher pitched, from the opposite side of the trailer. "How many are there?" I whispered. "4, I think," Ray replied. "2 big ones and 2 smaller. A family." Another rock struck near the door, this one hard enough to leave a visible bulge in the metal from inside. Then the trailer moved, not the shaking from impacts, but an actual shift, as if something had pushed or pulled on one corner. The dishes in the sink rattled. "They're trying to tip us," Ray hissed, gripping his shotgun tighter. I wanted to tell him that was impossible, that nothing could be strong enough to move a fully equipped camp trailer. But the evidence rocked beneath my feet as the trailer tilted slightly again before settling. That's when the smell hit me. It seeped through the sealed windows and door, a stench so powerful I gagged, like wet dog, rotten meat, and something musky, all combined into a nauseating cloud. "That's them," Ray said, pulling his shirt over his nose. "That's how you know they're close." The assault continued for what felt like hours. Rocks hitting the trailer, strange calls echoing through the forest, whoops and hollers that were answered from different directions, occasional pushing on the trailer that made the whole structure creak on its foundation. During one quiet moment, I crept to a small gap in the plywood and peered out. The moon had risen, casting silver light through breaks in the clouds. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye. A massive black shape, walking upright along the tree line. It was at least 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, arms hanging longer than any humans should. I jerked back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. "Saw one, didn't you?" Ray whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. Around 3 a.m., the attacks intensified. The rocks came faster, harder. The calls grew louder, more agitated. Something scraped along the roof of the trailer. Long, dragging sounds that couldn't be branches. "Should we fire a warning shot?" I asked, finger hovering near the trigger of my rifle. Ray shook his head. "Tried that once. Made them angrier, much angrier." So we sat in terrified silence, listening to creatures that shouldn't exist try to drive us from their territory. I found myself wondering what would happen if they succeeded, if they managed to tip the trailer or break through the door. The thought made my mouth go dry. By 5 a.m., the forest had fallen silent. The rocks stopped. The calls ceased. The terrible smell gradually dissipated. Ray and I remained frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to hope it was over. "Dawn's coming," Ray finally said, his voice hoarse. "They always leave before daylight." We waited another hour before daring to open the door. The early morning light revealed the night's damage. Dozens of new dents pockmarked the trailer's exterior. Rocks of all sizes, from golf balls to bowling balls, surrounded us in a scattered perimeter. But what made my blood run cold were the footprints, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the soft earth around the trailer. Some were massive, 18 inches long at least, while others were smaller but still larger than any human foot. They formed clear paths, leading to and from the dense forest in all directions. I knelt beside one print, noticing the 5 distinct toes, the deep arch, the clear heel. No bear made this. No known animal left tracks like these. "Now, do you believe me?" Ray asked, standing beside me. I could only nod, my entire world view shattered by indentations in mud. We spent the morning in silence, drinking coffee and avoiding discussion of what we'd experienced. I'd planned to stay another night, had promised Ray I would, but as noon approached, I knew I couldn't face another encounter. The sound of an engine rumbling up the logging road was our first contact with the outside world. A Forest Service truck pulled into the clearing, and Ranger Stevens stepped out. I recognized him from previous hunting seasons, a beefy guy with a salt and pepper mustache and perpetually sunburned nose. "Morning, Ray," he called, then nodded to me. "Got a visitor, I see." Ray introduced us, and the ranger surveyed the rock-strewn clearing with knowing eyes. "Rough night?" he asked. Ray laughed bitterly. "You could say that." Stevens walked the perimeter of the trailer, occasionally stooping to examine footprints. He showed no surprise, no disbelief, just the resigned expression of someone confirming what they already knew. "Had 3 fire watchers quit last season," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "One lasted 2 weeks, said he heard something mimicking his voice, calling his name from the woods." I found my voice. "You know about these things?" Stevens shrugged. "Been reports in these parts since before my grandfather's time. Forest Service doesn't officially acknowledge anything, of course, but we have trouble keeping staff at certain outposts. This one's probably the worst." His casual acceptance of the situation was almost as shocking as the night's events. He turned to Ray. "You sticking it out?" Ray looked at his damaged trailer, then back at the ranger. "Season's almost over, I'll make it." Stevens nodded approvingly. "Supply runs next week. Need anything special?" "More coffee and ammunition." After the ranger left, I started packing my duffel. Ray watched from the doorway but didn't try to stop me. "You think I'm a coward?" I said, not meeting his eyes. "No." His voice was soft. "I think you're sane. I'd leave too if I could." I paused my packing. "Come with me, Ray. This job isn't worth it." He shook his head. "I've got 6 weeks left in the season. If I quit now, I lose my unemployment benefits for winter. I can't afford that." I wanted to argue, to tell him no paycheck was worth what he was enduring, but the defeated look in his eyes told me he'd already weighed these options countless times. When Stevens returned from checking fire conditions in the area, I asked if I could hitch a ride back to the main road. Ray and I said our goodbyes with an awkward handshake that turned into a brief, tight hug. "Be careful," I told him, "and call me when you're out of here." "I will," he managed a smile. "At least now you know I'm not crazy." As Ranger Stevens drove me away, I watched Ray's figure growing smaller beside his dented silver trailer. The massive trees seemed to close in behind us, swallowing the clearing from view. "He'll be all right," Stevens said, noticing my backward glance. "They rarely hurt people, just want us to know whose territory it really is." I didn't respond. My mind was filled with the memory of massive footprints in mud, strange calls in the darkness, and the overwhelming stench of creatures that shouldn't exist. Ray called me 6 weeks later from a payphone in Millerville. He'd finished his contract and made it out. He never went back to the fire tower, and neither did I. But sometimes on dark nights when wind moves through trees outside my window, I remember those hours in a metal trailer in Mount Baker National Forest, and I wonder who, or what, is truly master of the wild places of our world. Story 14. The summer heat pressed down on us like a hot iron, making the air shimmer above the picnic blanket where Mom and Ed sat laughing. I watched them from the edge of the clearing, my 13-year-old mind both happy for Mom's newfound joy and resentful of the intrusion into our family. Ed wasn't bad. He fixed things around the house and never raised his voice, but he wasn't Dad. "Can me and Timmy go explore?" I asked, kicking at the dry grass beneath my sneakers. Mom looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Not too far, Jason. Stay where you can hear us if we call." Ed nodded. "Those old railroad tracks run about a half-mile that way." He pointed west. "Might be interesting for the boys. No trains run there anymore." "Be back in an hour," Mom said, already turning her attention back to Ed. I grabbed my little brother's arm. "Come on, Timmy." Timmy, all of 9 years old with a mop of brown hair that never stayed combed, grinned up at me. "We gonna find treasure?" "Maybe." I led him away from the picnic spot, through the trees that lined the Lewis River. The water gurgled beside us, clear and cold even in the summer heat. We found the tracks easily enough. They cut through the forest like a scar, 2 rusted lines running parallel into the distance. Weeds grew up between the wooden ties, and the metal rails felt hot when I touched them. "This way," I said, pointing along the tracks, heading away from our picnic spot. We walked for maybe 15 minutes, jumping from tie to tie, balancing on the rails. Timmy made it a game, arms outstretched like a tightrope walker. "Look!" he shouted suddenly, pointing ahead. The tracks disappeared into a dark hole in the hillside, a tunnel. It wasn't very big, maybe 15 feet tall at the entrance, with moss growing on the stone archway. The inside looked cool and dark, a relief from the beating sun. "Whoa," I breathed. "A real train tunnel." Timmy bounced on his toes. "Can we go in? Please, Jason?" I hesitated, peering into the darkness. "I don't know." "We got permission to explore," Timmy argued. "This is exploring." He had a point. Besides, I was curious too. "Okay, but we stick together." The temperature dropped as soon as we stepped inside. The walls were damp with condensation, and water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The tunnel curved slightly to the right, so we couldn't see all the way through, but there was enough light from the entrance to see where we were going. "It smells funny in here," Timmy said, his voice echoing. He was right. The air had a musty, earthy smell, like a basement after rain. We kept walking, our footsteps crunching on gravel between the ties. The curve of the tunnel became more pronounced, and I noticed something odd. There was light visible at the far end, just a pinprick the size of a dinner plate. "Look, we can see the other side," I said, pointing. Timmy squinted. "There's something there." I stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "In the light. Something's blocking part of it." I focused on the distant circle of light. He was right. Something was silhouetted there, a dark shape against the brightness. At first I thought it might be a branch hanging down, or perhaps some debris fallen across the tracks. "It's probably nothing," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We continued forward. The shape didn't move, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a branch. It was too solid, too deliberate in how it stood there. "Jason," Timmy whispered, grabbing my hand, "I think it's an animal." A shiver ran down my spine despite the cool air. About 200 feet away now, I could see the shape more clearly. It was standing upright, not on all fours like a deer or bear would be. "Maybe we should go back," I suggested, but curiosity pushed me forward even as unease settled in my stomach. 150 feet, 125. With each step, the shape became more defined. It was big, really big, and definitely standing on two legs. At 100 feet away, I felt it, a sensation of being watched that was so intense it made the hair on my arms stand up. This wasn't just an animal watching us pass by. This was something aware. "Jason," Timmy's voice quavered. "What is that?" I couldn't answer. The figure stood perfectly still, silhouetted in the far entrance. It was massive, far bigger than any man I'd ever seen. Its outline showed broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and a head that seemed to almost touch the top of the tunnel. 75 feet now. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to grab Timmy and run, but I couldn't. Some force pulled us forward, step by step, toward the enormous silhouette. 50 feet away, I could see hair, thick, bristly brown hair covering its entire body. It shifted position slightly, and I gasped as I saw muscles ripple beneath that coat. This thing was solid, powerful in a way I'd never witnessed. Not like bodybuilders on TV or the wrestlers Timmy liked to watch. This was raw, natural strength. "It's a Bigfoot," Timmy whispered, his grip on my hand painfully tight. But that word seemed inadequate. I'd seen sketches of Bigfoot in books, gangly, ape-like creatures with hunched shoulders. This being was different. It stood fully upright, proud almost, with a presence that commanded the space around it. At 30 feet, I could see energy, actual energy, crackling through its hair like static electricity. The bristles moved slightly, not from wind, but from some force emanating from within the creature itself. 20 feet. We stopped walking. The tunnel seemed to hold its breath. The creature stood directly in the circle of sunlight now, deliberately showing itself to us. Its massive calves bulged with muscle, each one thicker than my waist. Its chest expanded with each breath, broad as a refrigerator. If a grizzly bear could stand upright and add 200 pounds of pure muscle, it still wouldn't match this being. "It's the Andre the Giant of Bigfoot," I whispered, remembering the massive wrestler from TV. But even that comparison fell short. This wasn't just a large version of something familiar. This was something entirely different, something that didn't belong in our world of picnics and train tunnels and soon-to-be stepfathers. And then I saw its eyes, brilliant blue. They caught the sunlight and seemed to glow from within. Not animal eyes. These held intelligence, purpose, wisdom. They fixed on me with such intensity that I felt naked, exposed, as if this creature could see right through me to every thought and feeling I'd ever had. A smell reached us then. Strange, but not entirely unpleasant. It reminded me of the feed corn in Grandpa Miller's barn, mixed with fresh-turned soil and that white paste we used in elementary school art class. The scent filled the tunnel, wrapping around us like a blanket. Timmy's hand relaxed in mine. "I'm not scared anymore," he said softly. I nodded. The fear had drained away, replaced by something I couldn't name. The creature hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but somehow I knew it meant us no harm. In fact, the longer I stood there, the more I felt something else. Affection. Not from me toward it, but from it toward us. It cared about us. Two random kids who had wandered into its domain. It felt protective, watchful, concerned. But there was more. Images began to flash through my mind. The river flowing beside us, but wider, wilder than it was now. The forest, taller and more dense. The hills, slightly different in shape. Time. I was somehow seeing this same place through time. The creature blinked slowly, deliberately. One massive hand, a hand with fingers longer and thicker than mine, but undeniably a hand, raised slightly, palm out. Not threatening, greeting, words formed in my mind, not spoken, not heard, but understood all the same. "I have watched, for longer than your oldest stories. I have seen your kind grow, change, build, destroy, rebuild." My mouth went dry. The creature was communicating with me. "You are young. You can still see, still feel, not yet blinded." What are you? I found myself asking aloud. The creature's head tilted slightly. I am guardian, watcher, memory keeper. Memory of what? Of before, of always, of what comes next. Beside me, Timmy stood transfixed. Are you talking to it, Jason? He whispered. I think it's talking to me, I answered, not taking my eyes off the creature. Both. I speak to both. Can everyone see you? Timmy asked. Only those who can still see. Children, some adults, those who remember how to look. Why are you showing yourself to us? I asked. The creature's massive chest expanded with a deep breath. You walk between. Not child, not adult. Soon you forget how to see, I remind, before the forgetting. A sadness washed over me, not my own, but the creature's. It knew something was ending. My childhood, my ability to believe in things like this. I won't forget, I promised. The creature's eyes crinkled at the edges, a smile without moving its mouth. You will, but part remembers. Deep, hidden. That is enough. It shifted its weight, and I noticed something I hadn't before. Despite its massive size and obvious strength, it moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, respectful of its own power. Time short. Others call you soon. As if on cue, I heard Mum's voice, distant but clear, carrying through the forest outside. Jason, Timmy! The creature nodded once. Go. Remember while you can. Will we see you again? Timmy asked, his voice small. Perhaps, in dreams, in moments between thinking, when you most need remembering. It stepped back, away from the circle of light at the tunnel's end, its massive form melting into the shadows with surprising quickness. You protect each other, brothers, important, sacred bond. And then it was gone. No footsteps, no sound of retreat, just gone. Timmy and I stood there for several long moments, staring at the now empty circle of light. Finally, I gave his hand a gentle tug. We should go back. Mom's calling. We turned and walked toward the tunnel entrance we'd come through, neither of us speaking. The air seemed normal again, the tunnel just a tunnel. But the memory of those blue eyes stayed with me, burning like an afterimage when you look at the sun. Outside, the summer heat hit us like a wall. We blinked in the bright light, the tunnel already feeling like something from a dream. Jason! Timmy! Where are you boys? Mom's voice sounded worried now. Coming, I shouted back, leading Timmy along the tracks toward our picnic spot. Timmy pulled on my hand, making me stop. Are we going to tell Mom? I looked back at the dark mouth of the tunnel, then down at my little brother's face. Already the experience was fading, becoming fuzzy around the edges like a dream upon waking. No, I said finally. I don't think anyone would believe us. I'll remember, though, Timmy said firmly. I'll never forget. I nodded, but somehow I knew the creature was right. We would forget, or at least push the memory so deep it would seem like something we'd made up. That's what growing up meant, learning to ignore the impossible. We found Mom and Ed packing up the picnic. Mom looked relieved when she saw us. There you are. Find anything interesting? Timmy opened his mouth, but I spoke first. Just the old tracks. Nothing special. Ed ruffled Timmy's hair. Sometimes exploring is its own reward, right, buddy? Timmy glanced at me, then nodded. Yeah, its own reward. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I tried to hold on to every detail of our encounter. The blue eyes, the crackling energy in the bristly hair, the smell of corn and soil and paste, the feeling of being understood completely by something ancient and wise. But already the edges were blurring, reality asserting itself. By morning, it would feel like a vivid dream or a story I'd told myself. 23 years passed before Timmy and I ever spoke of it again. We were helping Mom clean out the attic of her and Ed's house when I found an old shoebox of drawings. On top was a crayon picture Timmy had drawn the week after our picnic, a brown figure with blue eyes standing in a circle of yellow. "You remember?" Timmy asked quietly, seeing what I was holding. I nodded slowly. "I thought I'd dreamed it." "Me too. But sometimes when I'm half asleep, I still smell that weird smell, like corn and dirt. And school paste," I added. We looked at each other and smiled. Not the smile of people sharing a childhood fantasy, but of people acknowledging a truth too strange for the adult world we now inhabited. "Think it's still there?" Timmy asked. "In that tunnel?" I shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's wherever people need it to be. You know what's weird? I've never been afraid of the dark, not since that day." I hadn't either, I realized. Not once in all these years. We never told anyone else, not even after all this time. Some experiences can't be shared with those who weren't there. Some memories are too sacred, too personal to expose to disbelief. But on nights when the world feels cold and empty, I sometimes close my eyes and see those brilliant blue ones looking back at me. And for just a moment, I remember how to see again. Story 15. The growl came from somewhere behind the trees, low, guttural, not quite a bear, not quite a wolf, something else. I stopped walking and turned my head, scanning the dense line of pines that bordered our campsite. Nothing moved except snow falling in clumps from branches. "Caleb, get your city ass over here and help with this tent." I turned back to see Darren, red-faced from exertion and the flask of whiskey he'd been hitting since we started the hike up. This whole bachelor party weekend in Glastonbury wasn't my idea of fun. 4 days in the Vermont mountains in February, with 6 guys I barely knew, except for Darren, my college roommate who dragged me along because you need to get out more. "Coming," I called, taking one last look at the trees before trudging through the ankle-deep snow. I'd grown up in Burlington, not exactly a metropolis, but urban enough that camping trips were rare and unwelcome interruptions to my normal life. Now at 32, I'd somehow been convinced to join this adventure for Darren's last hurrah before marriage. "Did you guys hear that sound just now?" I asked as I grabbed a tent pole. "What sound?" asked Todd, the best man, already 3 beers in. "Like a growl. From over there." I nodded toward the trees. "Probably just the wind," Darren said, laughing. "Or your imagination. City boys scared of the big bad forest." The others, Mark, Jason, Kevin, and Pete, joined in the laughter. I forced a smile and kept working on the tent. No point arguing. They'd been drinking since we parked the trucks at the trailhead 3 hours ago. We finished setting up camp as daylight waned. Temperatures dropped fast as night approached. The fire Todd built roared impressively, and soon beers and whiskey flowed freely. Stories about Darren's embarrassing moments took center stage, followed by increasingly exaggerated tales of their own outdoor adventures. I sat quietly, nursing a single beer and listening. The growl came again around 8 p.m., deeper this time, closer. I straightened in my camp chair and looked toward the sound. "Guys, seriously, you didn't hear that?" "Hear what, Caleb?" Mark asked, mid-story about some fishing trip. "That growl, it was loud." "Man, the only thing making noise around here is your empty stomach," Jason said, tossing me a bag of chips. "Eat something." I took the chips but kept my eyes on the tree line. The fire's light barely penetrated the darkness beyond our camp. Anything could be out there, watching us. "Maybe it's Bigfoot," I said, half joking. The laughter erupted immediately. Pete nearly fell off his log seat. "Bigfoot! Holy shit, Caleb!" Darren wiped tears from his eyes. "Next you'll be telling us about alien abductions." "The Vermont Yeti," Todd added, making his voice deep and spooky. "Coming to steal your beer and your women." More laughter. I forced another smile and looked down at my boots. Fine. Let them laugh. I knew what I heard. By midnight, everyone except me was completely wasted. Kevin had already passed out in his tent. Todd was telling the same story for the third time. Pete and Jason were arguing about football statistics that neither could remember correctly. And Darren, the guest of honor, was swaying dangerously close to the fire. "Gotta piss," Darren suddenly announced, standing up and immediately stumbling sideways. "Whoa there!" I jumped up and caught him before he face-planted into the snow. "Let me help you out." "My hero," Darren slurred, throwing an arm around my shoulders. "Lead the way, Bigfoot hunter." I guided him away from camp toward a cluster of trees that offered some privacy. The night had turned crystal clear, with a full moon illuminating the snow-covered landscape. Our breath formed thick clouds in the freezing air. "Far enough," I said, stopping about 50 yards from camp. "Do your business here." Darren fumbled with his zipper while I turned away, scanning our surroundings. That's when I heard it again, the growl, much closer now. My whole body tensed. "Darren, hurry up!" "Can't rush art, my friend," he mumbled. The growl came again, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy moving through snow. My heart rate doubled. "Darren, seriously, we need to—" My sentence cut short as something shoved me hard from behind. I fell face first into the snow, the cold shock momentarily paralyzing me. I rolled over, expecting to see Darren playing a drunken prank, but instead I saw him running, actually running through the snow, surprisingly agile for someone so drunk. "Darren!" I called, scrambling to my feet. "What the hell?" "Did you see that?" he yelled back, his voice suddenly sounding much more sober. "Holy shit, did you see it?" I ran after him, my boots crunching through the snow crust. "See what? Darren, stop!" He finally halted about 30 yards further, pointing at the ground. When I caught up, breathing hard, I followed his finger to what he was indicating. A footprint. But not just any footprint. It was massive. At least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. 5 distinct toes spread wide, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from each. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. "That's not human," I whispered, kneeling beside it for a closer look. "It's one of the guys," Darren said, but uncertainty laced his voice. "They're messing with us. Payback for the Bigfoot comment." I shook my head slowly. "Look at the toes, Darren. The claws, and the size. No human foot looks like this." "It's a prank," he insisted, but he was looking around nervously now. "They made fake feet, you know, like those Bigfoot hunters on TV." "The guys are all back at camp," I said. "We just left them there." "Then who pushed you?" I had no answer for that. I stood up and noticed more tracks leading away from us toward a rocky area where the ground sloped upward. "There's more," I said, pointing. "A whole trail of them." Darren hesitated, then started walking toward the tracks. Despite every instinct telling me to return to camp, I followed. The moonlight made the white landscape almost as bright as day, and the footprints stood out clearly, massive impressions cutting a path through virgin snow. We followed them for about 100 yards until the terrain became rocky. The tracks disappeared among the boulders, but something moved ahead of us, something large. At first, I thought it was a shadow between two large rocks, but then it shifted, standing upright. Tall, at least 8 feet, broad shoulders covered in what looked like thick, matted fur, almost white against the snow, but with grey and brown patches. The creature stood perfectly still, its back to us, seemingly unaware of our presence. "Oh my God," Darren whispered. The creature's head turned slightly at the sound. Not completely around, just enough that I caught a glimpse of its profile. A flat, almost ape-like face, but with a pronounced brow and what appeared to be a short snout. I clamped my hand over Darren's mouth before he could speak again. The creature hadn't fully spotted us yet, and I intended to keep it that way. I began pulling Darren backward, slowly, carefully, my eyes never leaving the massive figure partially camouflaged among the rocks and snow. For 3 agonizing minutes, we retreated step by silent step. When we were about 50 yards away, near the original footprint, the creature moved again, climbing higher up the rocky slope with surprising agility for its size. Within seconds, it disappeared over the ridge. "Run!" I whispered, removing my hand from Darren's mouth. "Back to camp, now!" We ran. Neither of us spoke until we reached the orange glow of the campfire. The others were exactly as we'd left them. Todd still talking, Pete and Jason still arguing, Kevin still passed out in his tent. "Guys!" Darren shouted, causing everyone to look up. "We just saw a fucking Yeti!" I grabbed his arm. "Darren, maybe we shouldn't—" "No, seriously!" He pulled away from me, gesturing wildly. "Biggest fucking footprints you've ever seen. And then we saw it. Like 8 feet tall, white fur, the whole deal." Todd burst out laughing. "How much did you drink, man? You're seeing things." Caleb saw it too. "Tell them, Caleb." All eyes turned to me. I hesitated. These guys had already laughed at the mere mention of Bigfoot. Now we were claiming to have actually seen one. "We saw something," I said cautiously. "Big footprints, definitely. And there was something moving on the ridge." "Probably a bear," Jason said dismissively, standing up to look around. "It wasn't a bear," Darren insisted. "It walked on 2 legs. It had arms. We both saw it." "Sure you did, buddy." Todd stood up and guided Darren to a camp chair. "Sit down before you fall down. The Vermont Yeti coming through." More laughter. Darren tried to protest further, but his drunkenness undermined his credibility. After a few minutes he gave up and accepted another beer from Pete. The conversation moved on. I sat silent, replaying what we'd seen in my mind. That was no bear. The footprint alone proved that. And the figure among the rocks, its height, its posture, its movement, was nothing I'd ever encountered before. I slept poorly that night, listening for growls outside my tent. None came, but my dreams were filled with massive shadows moving through snowy forests. Morning brought bright sunshine and groaning hangovers for everyone except me. I emerged from my tent to find Todd already making coffee on the camping stove. "Coffee will be ready in 5, he said. "How'd you sleep?" "Not great," I admitted, grabbing a camp chair and setting it up near the rekindled fire. One by one, the others emerged, looking various shades of green and grey. Darren was last, his eyes bloodshot, hair matted to one side of his head. "Morning, Bigfoot hunter," Todd called out. "No Yeti attacks in the night?" Darren squinted at him, then at me. "What? You don't remember?" I asked. "Last night, what we saw." He rubbed his face. "I remember needing to piss. After that, it's pretty fuzzy." "You were ranting about seeing a Yeti," Jason said, laughing weakly. "You and Caleb had quite the adventure, apparently." Darren turned to me, eyebrows raised. "We did see something," I said firmly. "Don't you remember the footprint, the figure on the ridge?" He shook his head slowly. Man, I was wasted. I probably saw a tree and thought it was the abominable snowman. But the footprint was probably some weird snow formation, he cut in, or maybe some animal tracks that looked bigger in the dark. You know how things get distorted at night. I stared at him, incredulous. "You're seriously denying what we both clearly saw?" "Caleb, I was blind drunk. I would have believed in the tooth fairy if someone mentioned it." He accepted a cup of coffee from Todd. "Sorry if I dragged you into my drunken delusions." The others chuckled, and just like that, the matter was closed. Even the one person who could corroborate my experience was chalking it all up to alcohol and imagination. After breakfast, we packed up camp. I found myself constantly looking toward the rocky ridge where we'd seen the creature. Nothing moved there now. "Hey," I said to Darren as we were rolling up our sleeping bags, "let's go check out where we saw those tracks, just to be sure." He sighed. "Caleb, let it go. We were drunk, it was dark. There's nothing to see." "You weren't that drunk. You ran when you saw it. You sobered up pretty quick." "I don't remember that," he said firmly. "Look, we need to get packed up. The guys want to hit the road by noon." I realized then that he did remember, or at least part of him did. Something in his eyes shifted when I mentioned running. but he'd chosen to deny it. Maybe it was easier than accepting what we'd seen. Maybe the reality of encountering something that shouldn't exist was too much. I went alone while the others were busy dismantling the last tent. I found our tracks from the night before, leading away from camp, but when I reached the spot where we'd seen the massive footprint, there was nothing distinct left. The day's sunshine had already started melting the snow, deforming any impression that might have been there. I continued toward the rocky ridge anyway, following our path from the night before. About halfway there, I stopped. Something felt wrong. The hairs on my neck stood up. I was being watched. Slowly, I turned in a complete circle, scanning the trees, the rocks, the open snowfield. Nothing moved, yet the sensation persisted. Somewhere out there, eyes were tracking me. The growl came then, the same low, rumbling sound I'd heard yesterday, close enough that I froze in place. My breath caught in my throat. "Caleb!" Darren's voice called from the camp. "We're ready to go, man!" The sound of his shout broke the spell. I turned and hurried back to camp, not running but moving quickly, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. "Find anything?" Todd asked as I approached. "No," I said. "Nothing." The hike back to the trucks passed uneventfully. The guys talked about getting lunch in the nearest town and their plans for the week ahead. No one mentioned Bigfoot or Yetis or strange sounds in the night. As we loaded our gear into the trucks, Darren pulled me aside. "Look," he said quietly, "about last night. Maybe we did see something. I don't know. But what's the point, you know? No one would believe us anyway." "So you do remember," I said. He hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Bits and pieces. Enough to know it wasn't normal. But Caleb, what good does it do? We tell people we saw Bigfoot in the Vermont mountains, and we're laughingstocks for life. But the truth is we had a weird experience that we can't explain," he interrupted. "Let's leave it at that." He patted my shoulder and walked back to the others. I stood there for a moment, looking back toward Glastonbury Mountain rising behind us. Somewhere up there, that creature was watching, waiting, hidden among the trees and rocks. I got into the truck and didn't look back again. I knew Darren was right. No one would believe us. But I also knew what I saw, what we both saw. I made a silent promise to myself. I would never return to Glastonbury Mountain. Let whatever lived there remain undisturbed. Some truths aren't meant to be proven. Some discoveries aren't meant to be shared. But I would carry this knowledge with me. In the snowy forests of Vermont, Bigfoot isn't just a legend. It's real. And sometimes it watches us.